How did Darth Bane finally die? And how was the first line in the Rule of Two successfully achieved? Greetings, and welcome back to the archives. The Rule of Two began with the idea that the Sith penchant for infighting must be cultivated to their strength rather than to their weakness. In order to accomplish this, the Master must be willing to accept that one day their apprentice will use their teachings against them, destroy them for their mantle. Darth Bane decreed that any Sith who did not accept this reality was a fool and was unfit to be in the Sith Order. He knew that one day his own apprentice would rise against him. But what finally happened when that day occurred? When Darth Zana rose up to challenge her master to continue the cycle, what was the method that she used to end Darth Bane's life and to become the Dark Lord? Well, greetings. Today we aim to understand how the dynasty of evil began with the death of its creator. What's compelling is that Darth Bane grew very concerned about his apprentice in the latter years of his life. 20 years after having begun her training, as she had only attempted to betray him once, a plan that ended disastrously. It had been a decade since that point in time, and Zana had made no move to strike against Bane. He quickly became worried that his apprentice was too content with her role after having been it since she was a small child. What's so fascinating is that Bane doesn't fear her rising against him as most Sith do, but he feared that she would not. Therefore, she would render the whole plan behind the Rule of Two useless. Just as a master who could not accept the defeat that one day was unworthy of a Dark Lord, a student too would be unwilling or unable to defeat their master. They would be an unworthy apprentice. In response to this, Darth Bane had to get drastic. He needed to search the galaxy for another apprentice to potentially replace Zana with. But once she learned of his plan, Zana was spurred into action and began devising her own master's downfall. Killing Darth Bane was never going to be an easy task to begin with. Of all of the Sith Lords in the Old Republic, Bane ranks up there as one of the strongest. Not to mention he is one of the most intelligent men that has ever lived in Star Wars, and one of the most skilled lightsaber duelists. His physical strength is matched by only his mentality. He doesn't just use raw power to his advantage, but he takes it through a strategic mind, approaching any given situation. This was the man that convinced the old Sith Order to destroy themselves. Bane was a master at lightsaber combat as well. During his days as an apprentice at the Sith Lord's Academy on Korriban, he was secretly trained in one-on-one sessions with the Blade Master Kasim, the Academy's greatest duelist. This man was essentially the Sith version of Sindralig, and was considered to be among the best swordsmen of the new Sith Wars. When it came time for Bane to actually fight Kasim to the death, he nearly triumphed until the Blade Master pulled out a secret trick of his own. And even then, Bane was able to lure Kasim into a trap and defeat him with the power of the Force. And from this moment forward, Darth Bane would never lose another duel. By this point in his life, he had become a master of Form 5 Gem So, as well as Form 3 Sarisu, a deadly combination. Because of his physical stature, he could inflict shattering blows with every swing of his lightsaber. In Legends or the EU, Darth Bane's lightsaber hilt also sported a distinct curved design, making it appear hooked in appearance. Not only did this lead to more accurate blade work, but using two hands, Bane was able to hook the blade and use it as a lever to cleave through his enemies. This type of leverage only added to the intensity of his blows. At this point, he had learned to master the defensive style as well, once he got rid of the Orbalisk armor which had previously rendered him essentially invincible to any physical blows. Darth Bane felt that he was now vulnerable without the shell of coverage, and so he learned to shield himself, continuously swirling parries with his lightsaber. His perfection of Form 3 was so refined that he once trained by walking through rainfall with practicing the sequences in motion, and in doing this, not a single drop of water ever touched him. This perfect blend of purely offense and purely defensive forms created a nearly impervious style that no one could break. Darth Zana knew that it was not going to be with the blade alone that she would ever be able to triumph over her master. She deemed this impossible right off the back. Zana was so much smaller in stature than Bane, and used Form 3 with a saber staff. Her master had taught her since she wasn't going to be able to use physical power to overwhelm her enemies, she was going to have to outpace them. And while Zana was a fine duelist in her own right, we need to be clear, she was nowhere near the level of Darth Bane. This was a hard lesson that she had learned once before when she had attempted to betray her master. Back in that day, he was still consumed with the Orbalisk armor which kept him from getting damage from any lightsaber blows. He attacked her in a savage fury when he learned of her treachery. He nearly ended her permanently. as he used his lightsaber to effortlessly smash down her defense. This was a statement that Zana would never forget. And so, although Zana would continue to hone her skill with the blade, she knew that it was a fool's bargain to take on Bane in this area of expertise of the Sith. The day that their final battle began on the world of Ambria, they had begun their duel with the clash of lightsabers as predicted. This quickly turned against Zana, of course. Even though the two of them seemed evenly matched as the duel began, it was apparent that as time went on that Bane was simply too strong, and after their first interaction of the lightsaber, Zana knew that she would not survive another engagement. But Zana had strengths all her own, strengths that she knew that Darth Bane could not match. Darth Zana may have not been a masterful warrior as Bane was, but she was something else, a skilled sorceress. Sith magic is an incredibly complex field of study within the dark side, even for Sith. Some can't even attempt to use it without first being born with a deep aptitude and connection to it. And while Darth Bane admitted to finding Sith sorcery interesting, he had no real talent for the study, and so he passed on all of those books and all of those knowledge to his apprentice. And when he did, he issued her a stern warning, should she ever attempt to use these spells against him, that he would utterly destroy her. This warning, though, was only meant to be in effect until the day that she challenged him. In the novel, Darth Bane full well knew that she would undoubtedly unleash her spells against him one day. Darth Bane's warning was to tell her not to try before she was ready. In fact, Bane had been preparing for the day that Zana would challenge him ever since he found her. The novel says this: he had encouraged Zana's training in Sith sorcery, knowing she might very well use it against him one day. If it turned out that he wasn't strong enough to survive this, then he wasn't worthy of being the Dark Lord. That didn't mean, of course, that he was unprepared, however. Dark side sorcery was complex. It attacked the psyche in ways that were difficult to explain, and even more difficult to defend. Bane had no real talent for it, yet he had done his best to study the techniques. What he learned was that the only real counter was the victim's strength of will. This was to be the last secret weapon against Bane, and what a weapon it was. There are very few sources in Star Wars that display the power of Sith sorcery quite like how Zana does. She begins her attack with a perplexing assailment of Bane's very mindscape, of the mind itself. Zana opens herself up to the dark side of the Force and unleashes her fury. This is what the novel reads. Zana's assault began as a sharp pain in his skull, like a hot knife stabbing directly into his brain before carving down to slice the two hemispheres in half. Then the knife exploded, sending a million burning shards in every direction. Each one burrowed into his subconscious, seeking out buried fears and nightmares only to rip them free, to haul them to the surface. Darth Bane let out a scream and dropped to his knees. When he stood up to the sky, it was thick with a swarm of flying terrors. Their wings were torn and ragged, leather flaps of skin hanging from their exposed bones. Their bodies were small, malformed, their twisted legs ending in long, sharp talons. Their flesh was a sticky yellow, the same color as the faces of the miners who had died on Apatros after being trapped in a gas-filled chamber for too long. Their features were now inhuman, but their burning eyes were unmistakable. Each creature was staring at him with the hate-filled gaze of an abusive father. As one, they swooped down on Bane, their mouths screeching out a cry that sounded like his father's name. Hurst, Hurst, Hurst. But Bane would learn the truth quickly. He knew this was a trick. The beasts were not real. They were figments of his imagination born through repressed memories of his childhood. But his greatest fear manifested in physical form. He had conquered those years ago. He had only turned fear of his abuse into anger, hate, and because of that, power. He countered her spells with a primal shout, or what we know as a Force Bellow, a powerful dark side ability where a Sith unleashes a concussive wave of energy through an explosive scream. This is actually a different ability from a Force Scream, which cuts the Jedi off from the Force by instilling them with fear using the dark side. Bane's Force Bellow was so intense though that it actually manifested bright violet energy that erased all of the nightmares from view and knocked Zana to her feet. This would have been the end of her, but she had one final trick. Throughout her life, Zana had studied just the material not just given to her by her master, but also knowledge and material that she had found herself. And armed with this new power was unknown to Bane, a secret spell. Zana reached out to the very world of Ambria around them and gave corporeal form to the dark side that she sensed there. She summoned several long tentacles of dark smoky energy Each one was like a serpent at her command, and although the spell was taxing, it was insanely powerful. When one of the tentacles lashed out at Bane, he found that his lightsaber uselessly passed straight through it. Bane threw himself aside, but the tip of the tentacle still brushed against his left shoulder. The materials of his clothes burned away as if it had been hit with acid. A chunk of flesh beneath simply dissolved, and this is when Bane began screaming out in agony. This is what the novel reads. The damage was far from life-threatening, but it nearly sent Bane into shock. He fell hard to the ground, his jaw slack, and his eyes rolling back into his head. His mind was reeling from the brief contact. The pain radiated through every nerve in his body, but what he felt went far beyond the mere physical sensation. It was the raw heat of the dark side, but rather, it was something of empty chill. The void itself was spreading through Bane. It touched every synapse in his mind. It clawed at the core of his spirit, and in that instant he tasted utter annihilation, and Bane felt the true horror of absolute nothingness. This was the power that now Darth Zana commanded. It was not just physical damage, it was psychological. It attacked every part of him. Even when Bane attempted to use Force Lightning, it had no effect on the tendrils. Zana would then wrap one of these tentacles around Bane's arm, disintegrating it on contact and severing it completely. This forced him to drop his lightsaber out of his hand that he was about to murder her with. And with the very last bits of Darth Bane's strength, he clutched Zana's arm and attempted to invoke the ritual of essence transfer. From this point forward, it was a battle of wills, and the two identities of the Sith Lords contended for a single vessel. They teetered on the precipice of the void, Bane seeking to obliterate all trace of her identity, while Zana sought to cast him down into the blackness. For a moment they seemed to be evenly matched, neither gaining nor giving any ground. But then suddenly it was over. Zana was victorious, managing to expel Bane's spirit from her body and sending him to the realm of chaos. And that is how the creator, the Dark Lord of the Sith of the Rule of Two, died. It wasn't a straightforward method, as he technically didn't lose the duel. Bane had not been as prepared as he had hoped for Zana's sorcerous ways though. We are always told how dangerous Sith magicians are, but it's really cool to actually see one in action. Zana shows how just one or two spells are capable of severely wounding or killing a powerful Lord of the Sith. One of the most powerful in history, in fact. It's needless to say that Zana was completely overmatched in this duel. She didn't have the strength or the skill to contend with Bane in close quarters, but she managed to keep her techniques secret until it mattered the most. It's difficult to say whether or not she had the capacity to outsmart Bane entirely though, but she did keep a secret from him. One of the most potent forms of the dark side that we've seen in all of the lore, and she caught him off guard with it. The victory was true, but a narrow margin. It wasn't just her sorcery that won her the day, but her willpower as well, which was able to miraculously defeat that of Bane's. Perhaps there was a part of the Dark Lord that knew that his time was past. The regime of Sith Lords who have reigned over the centuries of Star Wars are often regarded as one of the darkest stains on the galaxy as a whole, with the reign of the Sith bringing destruction and decay across their dominion. The Sith have wrought immense hardships across the galaxy, with some of the darkest times in galactic history being directly correlated to our particular Sith Lord. While the Sith we are most familiar with are among the most brutal dictators and tyrannical executioners throughout the galaxy, is being evil a necessary prerequisite to being a Sith Lord? Are there Sith Lords who have mastered the ways of the Sith without the same evil doings as their peers? And are there any good Sith Lords in galactic history? Well, stick with us today, weary acolytes of the galaxy, and let's explore the life of the Sith Lord who was never actually corrupted by the dark side and might be regarded as the nicest Sith Lord to have ever existed. The Sith Lord that we'll be talking about today goes by the Sith name of Darth Vectivus, but his real name has been lost to history. Now, let's begin this tale of the Sith Lord that did no evil. This Dark Lord did not always adhere to the dark side, as before his tenure as a Sith, Vectivus lived a relatively mundane existence well into his adulthood, developing within a normal childhood and adolescence complete with friends, a loving family, and a set of honorable moral principles. Unlike many Sith Lords that were born in blood and tragedy, Vectivus was not, and he was fairly normal. He even had a normal occupation, as he served as a director of the Jonex mining colony, which was an asteroid located near the planet of Bimmel. and throughout his tenure as the director, he began to notice adverse effects that the asteroid was having on his employees. As Vectivus would later come to find out, the asteroid was saturated with dark side energies, and the volatile nature of the Force had caused many of his employees to be negatively impacted by the Force energy within. This would be Vectivus's first experience with the Force and the dark side in general, as despite being Force sensitive, his mundane life meant that he never had the ability to explore this part of himself. Given his own Force sensitivity, Vectivus became closely in tune with the dark side energy within the asteroid, and began to seek answers, eventually leading into his own studies being conducted into the dark side itself. More fascination based though, rather than obtaining power, as is the common rule in evolution of a Sith. As a gifted learner of the dark side, Vectivus developed an uncanny ability to manifest what is known as dark side phantoms, which were aberrations with connections to real living life forms from across the galaxy. Later, Vectivus would eventually set off in search of a Sith master to teach him the ways of the Force. However, he ensured the disbanding of the mining colony in the process, allowing his employees to seek work elsewhere that was far safer, setting them free without any negative effects. Given his set of pre-existing moral codes and principles, Vectivus was able to master the dark side without falling victim to the same allure that had corrupted his predecessors and led to them down a highly destructive path. What many Sith would deem as weakness, Vectivus saw as his greatest strength, and his ability to peer into the dark side and yet look away and not let it corrupt him. This largely set him apart from most of his Sith compatriots, who still existed at the time. Rather than becoming obsessed with toppling the Jedi Order or developing an infatuation with galactic domination, Vectivus simply sought to study the power of the dark side and sit in relative peace where he could study the history of the Sith and their place in the wider galaxy, much like the Jedi seeking to understand, not corrupt, and dominate. However, unlike the Jedi, his fascination lay with the dark side, not the light. Eventually, Vectivus would return to his mining colony and construct his own palace within the heart of the asteroid, where he would conduct his studies throughout the course of his long life. But unlike many other Sith Lords, he was continually surrounded by friends, family, and loved ones, as he learned and practiced, not venturing into taking malicious acts against the inhabitants of the galaxy, living in relative peace. In essence, Vectivus wasn't truly evil. He was curious. He had a healthy social circle and interactions with the people that he cared for, both from his past life before his journey as a Sith Lord and friends that he had made more recently in life after succumbing to the darkness. While his physical form died centuries before modern Star Wars history, he had become so infatuated with the creation of Force phantoms that his connection with his own palace that he was able to preserve his consciousness after his physical death. While this practice seems eerily similar to Force ghosts of the Jedi, he was one of the first instances of a living creature being able to manifest their consciousness within the cosmic force. In a sense, learning how to become a dark side Force ghost, something that in canon is not possible. Although his effectiveness was fragmented and not particularly stable like a Force Ghost Jedi would be. While Qui-Gon would become the prominent pioneer of this feat and would pass it along to the likes of Master Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi, this took place centuries before any of them had risen to prominence as Jedi Masters. This is where Vectivus's consciousness would reside in relative peace for centuries to come. Well after the fall of the Galactic Empire and Return of the Jedi, Vectivus was still around and conscious, still living in peace and still studying the darkness. It wasn't until a Dark Lady of the Sith named Lumaya established residence in the former Sith Lord's palace that he was eventually returned in a form of a disembodied consciousness. Lumaya would set up her residence in the ancient castle and use the ancient artifacts of Vectivus's legacy to further her own knowledge of the dark side. After discovering the lingering remnants of his spirit, Lumaya was able to use his own Force Phantom technique to effectively resurrect the mind and spirit of the late Vectivus in full, returning him to his former glory and former intelligence. As for centuries, his intelligence had been deteriorating and he was falling deeper and deeper into nothingness. Lumaya's ultimate goal was to restore order to the galaxy by using a figure with power and stature of a Sith Lord, while still maintaining the proper moral compass to rule with more compassion than someone like Palpatine had. And with this new discovery, she was ready to enact her full plan. Lumaya lured 3 Jedi Knights of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy into the home and initiated her tactics. And it is here that it is believed in his long existence that Darth Vectivus encountered the Jedi for the very first time in his long life. He would first come into contact with Nalani Din, who had been separated from her colleagues Jacen Solo and Ben Skywalker, prominent and powerful students of Luke. Here, Darth Vectivus attempted to prod Din into killing him, ultimately even taking on a visual form of Palpatine in order to push her into breaking her own moral code, which the Jedi youngling never did. The reasoning behind this had to do with his state as one of the very Force Phantoms that he had worked to master manifesting. As Vectivus explained to the Jedi, Force Phantoms were machinations tied to living beings in the universe, and when one was destined to die, the other would soon follow. Since she refused not only to kill him though, but the life form to which he was connected, he was left behind as Din sought to reunite with her comrades. Unfortunately, Din would find herself killed by the young Jacen Solo, who had begun his descent into darkness under the guidance of Lady Lumaya, ultimately assuming his role as Darth Caedus and beginning his own reign as one of the most notorious Sith Lords of the era. Deep into his legacy as Caedus, the legend of Darth Vectivus would once again surface when a Dark Jedi who had been in league with Lumaya by the name of Alim-Rar returned to the asteroid in order to further her use of the Phantom technique. The same technique used by Vectivus. By this time though, Lumaya had been defeated by Luke Skywalker, and Caedus had become an established Lord of the Sith. But the spirit of Vectivus remained until agents of the Sith of Korriban caught word of his presence. In order to prevent the Jedi from learning the significance of the asteroid, the Sith sought to destroy Vectivus and the asteroid itself, ending the reign of the Dark Lord once and for all. While the Sith converged on the asteroid, agents of the new Jedi Order had also tracked Rar's location to the desolate mining colony. And amidst the struggle, multiple fission bombs were planted deep within the heart of the palace, ultimately destroying the mining colony and any remaining presence of Vectivus's mind or spirit so far as anyone could tell. While Darth Vectivus had not been seen since, the uncanny and unusual nature of his survival might leave the door open for his return at some point in the near future, and could allow for Darth Vectivus to once again emerge from the shadows despite not having any particular desire to possess or dominate, leaving him as Vectivus, the Sith that did no evil in life nor death. There is a fortress buried beneath centuries of silence, not destroyed in war, not scorched by the light of a Jedi blade, but undone from within. Its halls, once adorned with Sith sigils, now lie cold and hollow, the stone charred and fractured by fire. It is a tomb, not of bodies, but of knowledge. No Jedi ever breached its gates, and no Sith dared to ever return, because what occurred within was not a collapse, but it was a purge, an execution of legacy, a self-inflicted wound that would bleed through centuries of Sith history. And at the heart of it stood a man calling himself Darth Gravid. Darth Gravid was a Sith Lord, a scholar, a heretic, and he nearly destroyed the very order that he swore to perfect. He called his doctrine the unifying path, a vision so radical, so blasphemous, that it drove him to destroy countless holocrons, artifacts, and rituals, not in rage, not in madness alone, but rather in faith. Gravid believed that the dark side was incomplete, that the Sith in their obsession with control and domination had lost everything vital to them, and he sought to fill that void with the very thing that they had sworn to oppose, with the light. What he attempted was not corruption, it was synthesis, an impossible reconciliation of opposites, a new vision of power through balance, and in doing that, he brought the Sith to the edge of extinction. Darth Gravid lived around 533 BBY, nearly 3 centuries after Darth Bane first established the Rule of Two. By this point in the history of the Sith, the Baneite lineage had solidified into something cold and methodical, a hidden war of succession, where knowledge was hoarded, power was passed down like a blade, and survival meant everything. But Darth Gravid was different. Where others sought strength through cruelty, he saw understanding. Where others sharpened their hatred, he studied. He was not the product of wrath, he was the product of doubt. He immersed himself in Jedi texts, not as an enemy, but rather as a student. He questioned the foundations of the dark side, and slowly, obsessively, he began to craft a brand new philosophy. He named it the Unifying Path. It was not simply a blending of Jedi and Sith teachings. This was something far more dangerous, the belief that true power came from embracing both light and dark, compassion and passion, restraint and fury, serenity and ambition. Gravid envisioned an order that could transcend the dichotomy of the Force, but the Force does not reward contradiction, it punishes. To walk between the light and the dark is to stand on the blade's edge, but cut from both sides. As Gravid delved deeper into his vision, his connection to the Force began to fracture. The dark side, sensing his hesitation, recoiled from him. The light, sensing his corruption, refused him. In reaching for balance, he became imbalanced. His meditations turned to obsession. His thoughts spiraled into fragmentation. His identity snapped. And worst of all, he began to lose his faith in the very foundation of the Sith tradition. In secret, he constructed a bastion. There he hoarded the greatest repository of Sith knowledge seen since the fall of the Old Republic. Rituals from the Golden Age, doctrines of alchemy, forbidden techniques scrawled in the margins of holocrons passed down from the Dark Lords of old. And at the center of it all, he guarded one power above all others: essence transfer. It was the lost ritual. Essence transfer was the closest thing the Sith had come to immortality, a technique that allowed a dark side spirit to leap from one body to another, defying death through sheer will. It was first discovered in the ancient era by Darth Endedu, later mastered by Vitiate, and obsessively pursued by Darth Bane in his final days. But Gravid may have perfected it. Some believe he uncovered fragments of Endedu's original teachings, pieces that Bane never found, and that Palpatine would spend a lifetime trying to recover. If the stories are true, then Gravid held in his hands the last complete pathway to Sith immortality, and then he destroyed it. The ritual of essence transfer was not lost to time, it was lost to flame. In Gravid's efforts to purify the Sith, he consigned their greatest secret to oblivion. Sidious centuries later would clone body after body in a desperate attempt to reconstruct what had already been burned by the hands of a man who believed that he was saving the Sith. As his obsession deepened, Gravid sealed himself within his stronghold. He raised force barriers around his bastion, isolating himself from the galaxy and from the Sith Order itself. Within those walls he began the Purge. One by one, holocrons were shattered, scrolls reduced to cinders, relics consigned to fire. The knowledge of worlds, the legacy of empires, gone. And then came another, Darth Gene, his apprentice, his shadow. She had not been taught these deep rituals. Gravid in his spiral withheld them, believing she too may be corrupted by the path that he had already begun to transcend. But Jean was no acolyte. She was trained in pain, raised in the crucible of the Rule of Two, and what she found behind those barriers was not enlightenment, it was betrayal. A Sith Lord who had turned his blade inward. A master who had destroyed their inheritance, a heretic burning the legacy of Bane to ashes, all in a pursuit of doctrine that had never belonged in the darkness. And so she did what a true Sith apprentice must. She challenged him. She breached the barriers. Darth Gene, the apprentice raised in the shadows of the Rule of Two, carved her way through the outer defenses of the bastion with fury and purpose. The fortress had once been a sanctum of power. Now it reeked of smoke, scorched parchment, and ritual fire. The air inside was thick with ash. The walls wept heat from weeks of quiet destruction. She moved through now a graveyard of power and of the inheritance that she deserved, her history. The holocrons were gone, shattered, burned. The scrolls unspooled into flame. Relics of unspeakable potency smashed against the stone. What had once been the most complete collection of Sith knowledge since the fall of the ancient empire had now all been reduced to a funeral pyre. At the center of it all stood her master. Darth Gravid turned slowly to face her. His robes tattered, his face pale, hollow. He was not armed, not in the traditional sense. His lightsaber hung at his waist, untouched. His eyes did not burn with hatred or fear. They burned with certainty. "I knew you would come," he said, "and I hoped. I prayed that you would see what I have seen." Darth Gene did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence was a blade, her stance her verdict. "The Sith are broken," Gravid whispered. "We build legacies of pain only to see them crumble in fire and betrayal. The Jedi, they fear emotion. We worship it. Both are incomplete. But together we could become something more." He gestured to the flames around him, to the blackened remains of the Sith power centuries old. "I destroyed this to make space for the future." Jean stepped forward. "You destroyed everything." And that is when the duel began. Gravid ignited his lightsaber first, not out of aggression but necessity. His style was like anything Jean had ever faced before. He moved like a man unbound from fear, casting aside the rigid ferocity of the Sith lightsaber combat for something slower, more fluid. An echo of Form 6, almost meditative. But behind that grace was power, terrifying, overwhelming power. Even fractured in spirit, even isolated from the full strength of the Force, Darth Gravid fought with the fury of someone who had trained alone in silence, sharpening himself not for survival, but for revelation. Jean, by contrast, fought with the raw, unfiltered brutality of the Baneite lineage. There was no elegance, there was no restraint. Her blow struck hard, fast, and with lethal intention. She wasn't trying to teach her master a lesson, she was trying to kill him. Sparks lit the chamber like flashes of memory, each one illuminating the ruins of a history lost forever. They fought atop the ashes of Endedu's rituals, between the cinders of Sith alchemy, near the hollow plinth where the last essence transfer scroll had turned to smoke. But still Gravid endured. "You still do not see it," he hissed. "We could be more than Sith. We could be whole." But even as he spoke, his movements grew erratic. His footwork staggered. The fractures in his ideology were manifesting in his combat. Hesitation clashing with instinct. Serenity interrupting rage. He struck with a Jedi's precision one moment, and a Sith's savagery the next. He was slowly becoming nothing. The turning point came not with a strike, but with a severing. Gravid landed a clean blow, arcing his lightsaber across Jean's left side in a vicious vertical slash. The blade bit deep, searing through her shoulder, arm, face, and chest. Flesh burned, blood hissed. Her scream echoed off the stone. She fell to her knees, unarmed, mutilated, broken. But she did not yield. There was no plea, no retreat, no surrender. "You destroyed the Sith," she rasped. "Now I will destroy you." And with that she rose. No lightsaber, no tactic, purpose. Jean threw herself forward, disarming Gravid with a burst of raw, violent power. Her pain had become a weapon, her fury unrestrained. She struck him with no elegance, but with desperation, with grief, and with betrayal. And in the end, Darth Jean killed him, not with the lightsaber, but with her hands. Gravid collapsed to the floor, eyes wide, not in fear, but in recognition. "You understand now," was the last thing he ever said. His apprentice did not answer. Jean stood over his body, her own ruined, her skin scorched, one arm hanging in shreds, but still she stood. In this moment, Darth Jean was not a victim, she was not a survivor, she was Sith. That was not a victory born of strength, it was born of sacrifice. Gravid, even with his broken connection, had nearly destroyed her. Had he embraced the dark side fully, he may have annihilated her without effort. Had he surrendered to the light, he may have become one of the wisest Jedi Masters of his age. But he chose neither, and the Force had abandoned him. His failure proved a truth older than the Rule of Two. The Sith cannot be balanced. They exist in opposition to the natural order. The dark side thrives in distortion, in extremes. The Jedi flow with that current though. The Sith attempt to twist it. To reach for both is to drown. The legacy left behind from this duel cannot be overstated. I would even go as far as to call it the greatest duel of the Rule of Two. With Gravid's death came the loss of untold power. The technique of essence transfer, known, studied, perhaps perfected, vanished in flame. What Bane had chased, what Sidious would later dedicate his entire life to reclaiming, was destroyed in a single generation. The rituals of mass sacrifice, the secrets of the Sith spirit binding, the ancient alchemy of the Golden Age, the voices of the Dark Lords who spoke through talismans and holocrons, all of them gone. And Darth Jean, the woman who preserved the Rule of Two, would carry her scars forever. Some say she replaced her lost limbs and organs with Sith technology, augmenting herself until pain became power. Others say she lived out only to train a successor, and then died of her injuries. Darth Plagueis believed the latter. But one thing is certain, without Darth Jean, the Sith would have died at that fortress. Without her pain, there would be no Darth Sidious, no Vader, no Empire. She was the hidden pillar of the Sith's future, a mutilated sentinel standing in the ashes of the past. The fortress fell silent. Its walls, once brimming with the echoes of power, stood hollow. The holocrons were gone. The scrolls were smoke. The ancient tongues that once whispered through the halls no longer spoke. Darth Gravid was dead. Darth Jean, scarred, broken, but victorious, emerged from the ruins not as a survivor, not as a conqueror, but as a vessel. A vessel for pain, for survival, and for the Rule of Two. But what she preserved came at the cost of the Sith would never fully recover. Because Gravid didn't just die in that fortress, he took nearly everything with him. The Sith have always been defined by their relationship with power, not only in its pursuit, but in how they preserve it, through their rituals, their relics, sorcery, and alchemy. Knowledge to the Sith is as sacred as dominance. Without it, there is no ascension, no legacy, no continuity. And yet Gravid deliberately, methodically erased centuries of that legacy. Among the rituals destroyed in this purge were some of the darkest, most potent, and most elusive powers that the Sith ever uncovered. Let's break down exactly what was lost and the consequences of it. Obviously, essence transfer, the apex of immortality for the Sith. First discovered by Darth Endedu, essence transfer allowed the Sith to project their consciousness into a new host, bypassing death entirely through sheer strength of will. It was more than survival, it was actual continuity, a means by which a Sith could live through generations, expanding their empires across lifetimes. Bane pursued the technique obsessively, attempting to transfer his spirit into his apprentice Zana. Vitiate, known later as Valkorion, many believe perfected it. He didn't just use it, he thrived on it. Leaping from body to body across centuries, Vitiate ruled over multiple empires in multiple identities. Through essence transfer, he essentially became a god. Sidious generations later would attempt to reclaim this lost art. He would pour vast resources into cloning, into body preservation, into Sith artifacts and hidden vaults, searching for a ritual that Gravid had already possessed. It was said that Gravid had accessed teachings from Endedu's own lineage, hints, fragments, perhaps even the full ritual itself. Not theory, not legend, practice, and that he destroyed it. Look at it like this. What Palpatine would spend a lifetime failing to reconstruct, Darth Gravid erased in an instant. This act alone made him one of the greatest failures in Sith history. But he didn't just stop there. The rituals of mass sacrifice came next. The ancient Sith were practitioners of large-scale sacrificial rituals, ceremonies that drained the life force of entire populations to fuel apocalyptic powers. Lords like Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, and Vitiate wielded these rituals without hesitation. These were not battlefield techniques, they were planetary incantations, designed to ravage worlds, summon entities, and empower a single Sith beyond comprehension. By the time of Bane, these practices had already faded from memory. But Gravid in his studies had reconstructed what many believed to be portions of it, recovered fragments from the holocrons of Sadow and Ragnos, rituals that drew a collective suffering, turning death into fuel. Those too were thrown to the fire. He also destroyed spirit anchoring and Sith object binding. One of the hallmarks of the ancient Sith Lords was their ability to anchor their spirits to objects, holocrons, tombs, and talismans. This form of pseudo-immortality allowed their consciousness to endure even after death. Karnus Mur, Zozan, and Endedu each demonstrated variations of this technique, binding their essence to artifacts that would haunt generations to come. But in the era of the Rule of Two, these powers are conspicuously absent. We see no true spirit-bound Sith, no essence-possessed objects, no haunted temples speaking with the voices of the dead. It's not because the rituals were myth, it's because Gravid destroyed it. Then he also destroyed alchemy and transmutation. The ancient Sith could warp biology, they could twist flesh, shaping beasts, creating monstrous Sith spawn through using dark side science and force incantation. The likes of Sadow, Kun, and Ragnos wielded these arts with terrifying ease. And while it's true traces of alchemy survived in the later eras, most notably in Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious's experiments, true Sith alchemy was never again seen at the scale practiced in the Old Empire. Gravid had restored pieces of it, and then he incinerated it. We learned that before he destroyed it all, he was essentially a great collector of this knowledge, a completionist in many ways. And this is where I think the story gets really haunting. Because Darth Sidious, often viewed as the culmination of the Rule of Two, was in many ways a restorationist. He was a scavenger, a Sith whose power was immense, and all of it was spent rebuilding what had already been lost. Sidious's obsession with temples, his relentless pursuit of ancient holocrons, his creation of clones, vessels, and Sith libraries, all of it stems from a single truth. Palpatine did not inherit a complete legacy. He inherited the ruins left behind by Gravid. Everything that Sidious did, every experiment, every corrupted artifact, every dark side excavation was an attempt to reclaim what should have been passed down naturally. Instead, he built an empire on fragments, on echoes, and even with all of his power, he never found what Gravid had destroyed. This is why so many fans and even characters in the lore itself believe that the ancient Sith were more powerful than their successors. It's not just mythologizing, it's reality. The ancient Sith wielded knowledge that allowed them to reshape life, defy death, to dominate through presence alone. Their power wasn't in lightsaber techniques or clever manipulation, it was in ritual mastery, in domination over the Force. The Rule of Two, by contrast, became more refined, but less esoteric, more focused, but less cosmic. They were clever, dangerous, and efficient, but they no longer played with the same metaphysical fire, because that fire had been put out by their own. There is only one figure in Sith history who mirrors Gravid's descent. That's Darth Traya. Like Gravid, Traya saw the Force as a prison. She questioned the binary between Jedi and Sith, believing that both were flawed reflections of a greater truth. She had also descended into heresy, abandoning dogma in pursuit of philosophical freedoms. But where Traya turned her hatred towards the Force itself, Gravid sought reconciliation with it. He didn't hate the Jedi, he didn't despise the Sith. He desired to unify them. He genuinely believed that serenity and passion could coexist, that empathy could enhance power, that balance was not the enemy, but the final form of mastery. And in trying to hold both visions in his hands, he shattered. Traya saw futility in the Force, Gravid saw potential, but both stood in defiance of what the Force really is, which is uncompromising. Gravid's mind broke because he tried to resolve contradiction with belief. He walked a path no one had successfully walked before, not because it couldn't be conceived, but because it could never survive. This is the final tragedy. Darth Gravid, for all of his heresy, was brilliant. Even in spiritual collapse, he wielded power that nearly killed his apprentice. Had he embraced the dark side without hesitation, he may have become one of the greatest Sith Lords of the Rule of Two. Had he embraced the light, he may have stood among the wisest Jedi of his era. But instead he chose to walk between, and the Force abandoned him for it. The unifying path is an inevitable one, because for every Sith who seeks to dominate, there will come one who seeks to understand, who questions the pain, who seeks another path. But the dark side does not evolve. The dark side devours, and in trying to save the Sith, Gravid nearly destroyed them. Darth Gravid's name is rarely spoken, his memory is buried, his legacy scrubbed from history, reduced to whispers, but his impact endures, because long after his bones have turned to dust, the Sith have still paid the price for his visions. And if you ever wonder why Sidious feared death so deeply, why he hoarded knowledge like a starving man, why he never truly trusted his own creations, it's because deep down, he was always chasing the ghost of Darth Gravid. There are Sith who hunger for power, Sith who crave domination, and Sith who seek immortality. But Darth Tenebrous, the master of Darth Plagueis, was something entirely different. To Tenebrous, the Force was not a mystery. It was not a storm to be ridden or a current to be endured. It was not the mystical will that the Jedi whispered about, or the ravenous hunger that the Sith glorified. To Tenebrous, the Force was an equation, a vast field of probabilities, a current that could be calculated, predicted, and he believed, even rewritten. Tenebrous was born a Bith, a species whose minds were sharper than nearly any in the galaxy. His gift for numbers, for formula, and for logic became the lens through which he would eventually view the Force itself. Where other Sith bowed to its passions or the darkness, Tenebrous treated it like a machine that could be engineered. His greatest experiment would embody that belief, the creation of something known as the Maxichlorians, a retrovirus he designed to rewrite the very cells of his body, turning the living conduits of the Force into long-lived entities that would preserve his consciousness even after death. To Tenebrous, this was proof that he had solved what millennia of Sith mystics and alchemists had failed to achieve. He would not fade into the Force, he would not surrender his essence, he would persist forever, calculated, engineered, and eventually perfected. And this was only half of his ambition, for if midichlorians were to be altered to preserve life, they could also be corrupted to destroy it. Tenebrous dreamt of a virus that could sever the Jedi from the Force entirely, an extermination not of flesh and blood, but of connection itself. The Bith were famed for their musicians and their scientists, but Tenebrous took the clarity of perception and turned it upon the Force itself. He believed that every vision of the future, every surge of power, every whisper of destiny was not divine mystery, but rather mathematical inevitabilities. His fixation was on precognition, and while the Jedi relied on intuition and the Sith relied on passion, Tenebrous relied on calculations. He believed that the future could be modeled like a starship schematic, a series of moving pieces whose outcome could be predicted if one possessed enough computation. To him, foresight was not an art or a mysticism, it was engineering. This led to the most heretical belief that the dark side of the Force was not a living will, not a malevolent current, but simply a source of energy, as controllable as plasma, as programmable as code. This view would shape everything he did. As Rugus Gnome, he designed some of the most advanced starships of the entire era, embedding his scientific brilliance into galactic engineering. As Tenebrous, he applied the same logic to the Sith's grand plan. It is easy to see how his arrogance grew. With each success, with each prediction that came true, he became more convinced that he had solved the riddle of the Force. To Tenebrous, the Jedi were deluded mystics, clinging to a philosophy of balance that had no grounding in reality. They treated the Force as sacred. Tenebrous treated it as circuitry. Yet, here lies the great irony. For in reducing the Force to a machine, Tenebrous blinded himself to its living essence. He believed he could not only predict the dark side's victory, but engineer it, that he could reshape the building blocks of the Force to serve his will. This conviction would lead him to his most infamous creation, the Maxichlorians. The midichlorians have been the foundation of a life's connection to the Force. Midichlorians are microscopic organisms that live in every cell, allowing communication with the currents of the galaxy itself. To the Jedi, they were a reminder that life and the Force were inseparable. To the Sith, they were proof that the Force could be measured, quantified, and even controlled. But to Tenebrous, midichlorians were not simply a connection to the Force. They were programmable, biological processors that could be rewritten and redesigned to serve a higher function. His most radical act was the creation of the Maxichlorians. Through a carefully engineered retrovirus, Tenebrous infected his own cells, altering his midichlorians to extend their lifespan beyond death. Where natural midichlorians would eventually dissolve back into the Force, Maxichlorians would linger, carrying fragments of his own consciousness forward. This was his answer to the greatest riddle of the Sith, the problem of mortality. For centuries, the Sith had sought to bind their souls, transfer their essence, or extend their lives through ritual and sorcery. Tenebrous dismissed these practices as primitive. He did not want to bargain with death through incantations or with alchemy. Tenebrous wanted a way to engineer death out of existence. And in his mind, he succeeded. When he died, his consciousness would not fade. It would persist through the Maxichlorians. He lived on, riding in the cells of the living, eternal not through ritual, but through science. But his triumph came at a cost. In rewriting his own biology, Tenebrous destroyed one of his greatest strengths, precognition. The gift of foresight that had once defined his genius, that was now completely gone. The equations no longer worked. His visions of the future became blind spots, blank horizons. But Tenebrous didn't mourn his loss. He considered it irrelevant. He had already calculated his future, the inevitability of the Sith's grand plan, the certainty of the dark side's ascendancy. He believed that foresight was now unnecessary, for he had already solved the equation of destiny. Here lies the core of his arrogance. To Darth Tenebrous, the Force was not alive. It did not have a will. It was not waiting to surprise him or to punish him. It was simply a current of energy, and he had rewritten its operating systems. This belief reveals why Tenebrous is so different from the other Sith, where Darth Bane bowed to the Rule of Two, where Darth Plagueis sought mastery through biology, and where Sidious sought dominance through politics. Tenebrous wanted to reprogram the very foundations of life. He was not content to master the Force as it was. He wanted to rewrite what the Force was allowed to be. The Maxichlorians were his first proof of this concept, his greatest achievement, his promise that when his body failed, his mind would not. He would endure in ways that no Sith ever had. But the Force is not an equation. It is not circuitry to be rewritten, and though Tenebrous did not yet realize it, the very creation he believed would make him immortal would become his eternal prison. For Tenebrous, immortality was only half of the equation. The other half was annihilation. If midichlorians could be rewritten to persist beyond death, then they could also be rewritten to die, to be silenced, to be erased. And if midichlorians were the conduit between life and the Force, then to silence them would be to silence the Force itself. This was Tenebrous' second great obsession, the creation of a targeted virus designed to sever the Jedi from all of their power. Not to kill them outright, not to cut them down with a lightsaber, but to strip them of the very gift that defined their existence. To Tenebrous, this was the ultimate proof of the dark side's supremacy, to turn the Jedi into ordinary beings with nothing but memory of what they had lost. The Jedi could not prepare for such a weapon. They had fought Sith Lords, faced armies, endured wars and purges, but no lightsaber could parry a virus. No meditation could preserve a connection once it was corrupted at a cellular level. To Tenebrous, this would be the ultimate victory, a clean solution. No battle, no victory on a field of war, but victory in biology. A single equation that would rewrite the destiny of the galaxy. He worked for decades on this project, refining his virus in secret laboratories, testing its theoretical potential. The virus was meant to infiltrate a Jedi's very cells, to alter their midichlorians so that they no longer responded to the currents of the Force. At its most ambitious stage, the project promised to burn out an entire bloodline of Jedi in a single generation, reducing them to husks with no access to the power that had defined them. But for all of his genius, this project ultimately failed. Tenebrous could not stabilize the virus, could not translate theory into weapon. It became a dead end, discarded but not forgotten. And yet, the horrors of this idea endured, because in the ambition of this experiment, we see the depths of Tenebrous' arrogance. He was not content to defeat the Jedi with war or politics or even deception. He wanted to delete them from the Force. It is here that we see how far his rationalism has carried him from the traditions of the Sith Order. Other Lords of the Sith had glorified the fight, the duel and the domination of battle. Tenebrous sought something colder, something clinical. His vision of victory was not conquest, it was sterilization. The Jedi rendered harmless by nothing more than a viral code. In this way, Tenebrous was a figure far ahead of his time. Where Sidious would later use armies and betrayals to destroy the Jedi, Tenebrous dreamed of a war won in silence. No grand battle, no climactic duels, only the Jedi awakening to find their power gone. Plagueis is remembered as the Sith Lord who sought to cheat death, the manipulator of life and the alchemist of biology, the one who nearly solved the riddle of immortality. But what is often overlooked is that this obsession was not born in isolation. It was the shadow of Tenebrous cast long over his apprentice. When Tenebrous had viewed the Force as an equation, Plagueis absorbed the rationalist lens and reshaped it for himself. The Bith had taught him to strip away mysticism, to reject the idea of the Force as a will, and to treat it as energy, waiting to be manipulated. To Tenebrous, the Force was programmable. To Plagueis, it was malleable, a biological system that could be bent with enough precision. Plagueis would take what his master began with the Maxichlorians and refined it into his own experience with midichlorian manipulation. If Tenebrous infected himself to carry his consciousness forward, Plagueis sought to reach into the cells of others, to bend life itself, to summon or deny existence at will. Where Tenebrous dreamed of erasing the Jedi through a virus, Plagueis pondered creating new life altogether. This is the great continuity of their line. Tenebrous gave Plagueis the lens, the Force as science, as numbers, as biology. Plagueis gave that lens ambition, taking his master's obsession and making it grander, stranger, and even more heretical. And yet there is a difference. Tenebrous believed he had solved the equation of destiny. He gave up precognition because he thought the future was certain, calculated. Plagueis was less absolute. He recognized the Force as volatile, uncertain, but still believed that it could be bent with enough knowledge. If Tenebrous was an engineer, Plagueis was the scientist. Both believe in the same truth, that the Force could be rewritten. They only disagreed on the method on how to do it. The death of Tenebrous should have been the end. Crushed beneath the collapsing cavern of Pal Demnik, his body broken, his own apprentice betraying him. This was the fate of so many Sith that preceded him. But Tenebrous is not like other Sith, so it's appropriate that his fate isn't either. His final words to Plagueis carried the cold recognition of a master who had foreseen his own defeat and calculated it into inevitability. But for Tenebrous, death was not the end. As his body failed, the Maxichlorians within him awoke. The virus he had engineered had done its work. His altered midichlorians carried his essence, his thoughts, and his will. Where the spirit of a normal being would dissolve into the cosmic force, Tenebrous' lingered. His consciousness slipped free from his corpse and into his apprentice, flowing invisibly into the cells of Plagueis. and for a moment, his victory seemed absolute and complete. The experiment had worked. He had achieved what thousands of years of Sith Lords had failed to grasp. He had conquered death not with sorcery, not with ritual, but with science. Within Plagueis, Tenebrous found a host. He could see through his apprentice's foresight, access the visions of the future that had been denied him after rewriting his own biology. At last, he believed he had proven his thesis. The Force could be programmed, and immortality was a solvable equation. But the vision that came to him was not one of triumph, it was of terror. Fans of our holocron of the worst ways to die in Star Wars are familiar with the fate of Tenebrous. Through Plagueis' eyes, Tenebrous glimpsed the smear of darkness that marked his apprentice's fate. Plagueis would be murdered by his own apprentice, killed before the work was complete. The grand plan would collapse. All of Tenebrous' careful predictions would unravel into failure. Plagueis would die. For the first time maybe in his life, the Sith engineer panicked. The certainty of his equations dissolved. The future was no longer inevitable, his model was shattered. In desperation, Tenebrous tore himself free of Plagueis, flinging his essence outward, seeking escape, seeking a new host. But in doing that, he discovered another flaw. The retrovirus that had granted him survival had also corrupted his foresight. Instead of stretching into the future, his perception collapsed inward. He was no longer looking ahead, he was looking back, trapped in a loop, forced to relive the last moments of his life over and over again. The collapse of the cavern, the betrayal, the failure of his calculations, his own death. It all played endlessly in a cycle without end. This was his eternity, not the triumph of immortality, but a mockery of it. He had become the prisoner of his own creation. And here lies the great irony of Tenebrous. He had believed the Force was an equation, that it could be solved, rewritten, reduced to code. He sacrificed his foresight to prove this. He corrupted his own cells to extend life. He dreamed of erasing the Jedi by silencing their connection to the Force. And now, the Force had silenced him. The Maxichlorians did not grant him the freedom that he had sought. They granted him a cage. They proved that no matter how the Sith sought to dominate the Force always found a way to dominate them. When we look back on the Sith, arrogance is a common thread. Bane believed he had perfected the Sith in the Rule of Two. Plagueis believed he had mastered life and death. Sidious believed he was the embodiment of the dark side, a god in the mortal flesh. But none of them ever dreamed as boldly or maybe as darkly as Tenebrous did. For Tenebrous' plan was not simply to defeat the Jedi through war or manipulation or extermination. His vision was colder, more absolute. He dreamed of a galaxy where the Jedi did not need to be hunted, where their lightsabers would gather dust, where their temples would stand quiet, where the Order itself would collapse not from battle, but in biology. One generation of Jedi waking to find their connection gone, then the next, then the next. A slow death not of flesh, but of essence. No clone armies, no great war, no duels, silence. That is what existed to Tenebrous. It is perhaps the boldest assault on the Jedi ever conceived, an erasure of their identity. And even though Tenebrous failed, the thought of such a plan still chills the imagination. And that is his fate. That is why it's so poetic. The Force does not tolerate arrogance without consequence. Plagueis was betrayed in his sleep. Sidious was consumed when his apprentice was redeemed. But Tenebrous was punished in the most fitting way imaginable. The man who believed the Force was an equation became trapped in an endless cycle, a broken line of code, reliving his death for all eternity. He sought to erase the Jedi from the Force. Instead, the Force erased Tenebrous. When you think of the Sith, you typically associate violence with being one of their core tendencies, one which is not only encouraged but is actually sought after, especially in potential apprentices. However, there was a time in the training of Darth Sidious where his own penchant for violence greatly concerned his master Darth Plagueis. Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. We've been waiting for you. Every young Sith has to go through the process of learning to harness their anger. For some, it has to be goaded out of them. For others, it's a matter of learning to use the anger that they have. But Sidious was a rare case in which his anger and bloodthirst was already on a level that exceeded where most Sith start, and it was so potent that Plagueis had to give him a lecture on control. While this feels counterintuitive to the entire doctrine of the dark side, there was great wisdom in the words of Plagueis, wisdom that Palpatine would use to achieve ultimate power one day. So join us as we open yet another holocron and discuss how Plagueis was both greatly pleased and greatly concerned with Palpatine as his apprentice. A bit of backstory is definitely due for this topic, and everything comes from the Legends novel Darth Plagueis. When Plagueis found young Sheev Palpatine, he was living as an aristocrat on the world of Naboo, his home. When he was born to House Palpatine, his father recognized immediately that he was not normal. As an infant, he was described as having a strength far too great for his size, and a quote from his father said that abnormality seemed to follow the boy everywhere. In order to not have his family seen as freakish, Palpatine's father Kasinga made copious amounts of money in order to cover up his son's strangeness, so that the Jedi would not come asking questions. For years, Kasinga Palpatine was ashamed of his son, and went out of his way to keep Sheev in a caged life. Sheev Palpatine was a beast at heart, something both he and his father would later acknowledge. But rather than having the beast within him tamed through proper training, it was caged, starved, and abused, making the beast feral and ravenous. It was something that Palpatine kept hidden from everyone, compounding this bestial nature with his lack of any regard for morality or a rule of law. Anytime the young Palpatine got in trouble or caused mischief to get his father's attention, the Patriarch of House Palpatine simply paid people hush money and kept his son out of prison in order to save face, never out of love. And so the boy learned from a very early age that if one had enough money, influence, and power, that they were above normal beings. But throughout the boy's childhood, he grew to hate his father, and his father in turn grew to hate him. But this wound would fester until the day that Darth Plagueis found Palpatine as a young college student of Naboo, Theed University in fact. At first, Plagueis used him as a pawn for a political game, but soon he discovered that he was powerful in the Force, making him an excellent potential student. But what he needed was to get Kasinga Palpatine out of the way first, both for his own political plans, as well as to liberate Sheev to do as he pleased. And so Plagueis would tell the young Palpatine an embellished story about how he had convincingly caused the deaths of his own family members, in order to inherit a fortune that he now possessed. This all had the intended impact on the boy, as the seeds of murder were now planted in the young Palpatine's mind. On one fateful day, that seed would take root. Disliking Plagueis' influence over his son, Kasinga organized Palpatine to be shipped to an off-world school, one where he had had no contact with the outside galaxy. Now enraged by this, Palpatine confronted his father and had yet another heated argument. However, this time their venomous words became actions, as they admitted to one another that they had always hated each other. Palpatine pushed his father far enough for the man to actually make a move to strike his son, but before he could, the power of the dark side was fully unleashed in the young boy. Palpatine would go on to commit patricide, matricide, and fratricide, executing his entire family with nothing but his raw, unbridled power in the Force in his bare hands. After in a panic, he would contact Darth Plagueis and tell him what had happened. The Sith was overjoyed that his manipulations had taken root, not only because Palpatine was now free to become an apprentice, but because he had already taken the first steps into the shadow of malevolence. Getting him to unleash his rage was now no longer an issue, and once Plagueis revealed his true nature to Palpatine, he inducted him formally into the Order of Sith as his apprentice. From that point forward, Plagueis would use the murder of Palpatine's family as a way to push him further. Plagueis would force the boy to relive the memory over and over again, putting him through extreme training and even torture sessions. The intention was to burn all of the guilt away from him, to make the act itself something that was visceral, important, something that Palpatine would see as normal to achieve his goals. But in this training, Plagueis noticed just how potent that rage and bloodthirst was within his new pupil. On one occasion, the boy lunged at his master like an animal, his nails outstretched like claws. He had been thwarted by a simple Force illusion, and never so much as touched Plagueis. And although the Sith Lord would nurture this desire in his apprentice to kill, he began to understand that the beast within Palpatine needed to be channeled appropriately, and was in actuality very dangerous to even the Sith. During one of these torture training sessions, Plagueis had Sidious crawling all over a frigid tundra, while Plagueis continually lashed and burned him with his lightsaber. Sidious asked his master how long it would take him to learn the truth of the dark side, but Plagueis answered slowly that it would be difficult to tell. As a human, he had very few physical strengths, his senses were weak, and his body wasn't meant to withstand real punishment. The apprentice then asked his master if he had any strengths at all, to which Plagueis responds, "You have the Force, my apprentice, and the talent to lead. More, you have the bloodlust of a serial killer, though we need to hold that in reserve unless violence serves some extraordinary purpose. We are not butchers, Sidious, like the Sith of the past. We are architects of the future." Plagueis begins to explain the true nature of the Rule of Two, how they are differentiated from the Sith Lords of old. While violence and anger were things praised by the Sith, the direction of those traits had to be changed. They weren't going into battle wearing armor and wielding lightsabers against the Jedi, nor were they conducting grand rituals with an audience of thousands of slaves and sycophants. The Rule of Two were politicians, bankers, and members of the elite ruling class, those that had infiltrated the very bureaucracy of the Republic itself, infiltrated its veins. They were existing right under the Jedi's nose, and had to hide their true nature until the moment to strike was perfect. There were moments when the Sith were able to reveal themselves, to use violence to serve their ends. Plagueis would have to defend his life from assassins. Sidious would need to get revenge on the men who were sent to assassinate his master, and Plagueis would do so again and again in order to kill any political enemies. In these circumstances, violence served their ends, but by and large the animals within them needed to be carefully restrained, lest the Jedi sense the darkness growing around them. This was why Plagueis took 10 full years to train Palpatine before letting him get into the public sphere. Palpatine had to learn to temper that bloodlust, to keep it carefully hidden within. Not to mention, as Plagueis said, they were not simple butchers. They no longer needed to hack up their enemies in order to win. They could destroy their enemies in many different ways now, such as manipulating the opinions of the masses, or even directly targeting the economy of the galaxy itself. This was the new form that the dark side had taken. One of secrecy. Palpatine would remember this lesson for the rest of his life, and would keep his true power hidden. Becoming Chancellor, he eagerly awaited the day where he could show his true power to the Jedi Masters. Until then, he tolerated being in their presence, and relished in the fact that his immense potential was going right underneath their noses. But the days of bombastic displays of power were not entirely gone. Plagueis knew that keeping this bloodlust in reserve would have many benefits, and this was a lesson that he passed on to his apprentice as well. In Sidious's own writings in the Book of Anger, he describes the practical benefits of hiding your rage. He would, in essence, liken it to refining it like a fine wine, letting it steep and stew, roiling within your soul like a storm waiting to be unleashed. And when you do, that pressurized and refined rage comes out in a godlike display of power. This is what he writes. When the Force is sensed and moved by emotion from the very center of the body and meditated from the lower vital centers of the being, it acts with the destructive power of a storm, the savagery of a beast. Anger is the most potent catalyst of this kind of power, and anger that becomes rage when channeled through the vital gate in the center of one's body can unleash absolutely unstoppable potency through the body itself. Add the exquisite control of a fine intelligence standing watching over the anger, and one has aggression that can kill with precision, crush cartilage from afar, or murder opponents from a great distance. I have learned that anger and will joined together are the greatest power. I have learned to meditate anger and will with clarity and precision, and I have learned to open the hidden reservoirs of dark power. Anger concentrated by will in the vital center of the body creates a portal through which vast energies are then released. This is the dark side. This practice of willpower holding back and channeling anger goes all the way back to Darth Vitiate, one of the Dark Lords to use this technique and gain more power before Sidious. Sidious would learn from Vitiate, his master's teachings as well, to make his own unending rage a well of power. Sidious attempted to teach the same technique to Vader, telling him to treat his anger like a precious resource, not to waste it on Imperial officers that displeased him. But Vader would not learn this concept the same way that his master had. It was of great concern to Plagueis that his apprentice's bloodlust could be tempered in this way first. Not only was it the key to the hidden power of the ancients, but it was important to Sidious's penchant for violence not disrupt the new ideology of the Rule of Two. This was the great lesson that Sidious learned, and this is when he truly became a member of the Rule of Two lineage. But the fact remains, Sidious's anger concerned Plagueis for a very long period of time, 10 years. I love hearing the lessons from refined Sith Lords like Plagueis and like Sidious. It is good to remember that being a Sith and using the dark side isn't just about cutting loose and killing everyone all at once. And while this is the quick and the easy path, there is still nuance and finesse to its technique. Just like how there is a right and a wrong way to use the light side as well, there is a correct and an incorrect way to use the dark side as a Sith. Or perhaps we should say, an effective and an ineffective way. The dark side touts that it grants power, but there are better ways of going about it which yield the best results. And so even though the instinct is given to every black-hearted inclination, the most powerful Sith Lords teach that by disciplining their rage, that by letting it simmer, that by refining it, that is where true power in the dark side is held. But anyway, lore junkies, we do hope that you enjoyed this little deep dive into Palpatine's own training years. We typically think of him as the all-knowing Sith Master, and so it's always a great time to revisit the time when he was an impatient apprentice, still learning the ropes of the Rule of Two. The truth is, the Jedi are completely wrong about how the dark side works, and even the Sith are laughing at their mistake. Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. The Jedi teach that anger, fear, and aggression are of the darkness. To feel these emotions and to act on them would lead one down a corruptive path from which they could never return. This was the rhetoric taught for centuries among the Jedi Order. As for outsiders looking in though, it does seem that this could be true. When we observe Jedi giving into these emotions, they tap into paranormal power that often results in destruction. But what if we told you that according to the Sith, the Jedi's anger actually has almost nothing to do with the dark side? While in most cases Sith are egging the Jedi to give in, they actually know something that the Jedi do not. In the Legends novels, we've uncovered rare words of wisdom from Sith Lords who denounce the notion that angry Jedi ever really harness any modicum of the dark side, thus making their fear of emotion completely irrational. In today's holocron, we are going to take a critical look at the Jedi's approach to the dark side, and why the Sith, for once, have the right idea. If you enjoy these more philosophical discussions concerning the Force, then be sure to crush that subscribe button and comment down below what you want to see us discuss next. Now my friends, let us begin, and to peel back the lies of the Jedi Order. Let's begin with the fundamentals of the Jedi doctrine on this subject before we get into the perspective of the Sith. The Jedi teach that acting upon one's selfish emotions concerning fear, anguish, and hatred can cause one to tap into the malevolent reservoirs of energy known as the dark side. In the book The Jedi Path, Chief Librarian Resteli Quist writes this: "The dark side is the selfish, impulsive energy you feel when you have not set yourself at peace. Members of the Order who give themselves over to these destructive emotions often experience an irreversible spiritual corruption, one that marks them as a darksider. Those who follow the ritual of a specific dark side philosophy become Sith. Not all darksiders are Sith, though the Sith have proven to be the most persuasive and malevolent power of the past several millennia. And of course, in the words of Master Yoda, anger, fear, aggression, the dark side are they. This manifests as a potent display of power which quickly becomes addictive. It feels much stronger in the moment, but it will often come at a terrible price. As Mace Windu accurately summarized it, the dark side is a torch which burns brightly but quickly burns out. Let us be very clear. The dark side of the Force should be treated with great concern. It is the enemy of all life. It desires to consume, to dominate, and control. It speaks to the most selfish parts of an individual, making itself seductive and enticing by promising to give them the power to make all their greatest desires come true. But then it transforms them into something unrecognizable. Even those who believe that they can use the dark side without harm, or believe they're using it righteously, are only deceiving themselves. For while one may begin the dark path with noble intent, the dark side will corrupt those intentions and create a monster. There are constant examples of this occurring and actually repeating itself. One of the earliest instances is the tragic story of Ulic Qel-Droma. Ulic was a valiant Jedi Knight who lived around the time of 4000 BBY. Ulic was trained by one of the most legendary Jedi in history, Arca Jeth, and he along with his friends put a stop to a Sith spirit uprising on the planet of Onderon, bringing peace to its civilization. Ulic was a fine warrior and the bravest of the Jedi. But when his master was murdered by a cult known as the Krath, Ulic swore that he would avenge his teacher. He planned to infiltrate the Krath cult to learn their secrets and dismantle them from the inside. Little did he know that they had been practicing the Sith arts, so in order to maintain his cover, Ulic would sacrifice one moral after another until the line between pretending and being was completely blurred. And when his treachery was found out, the cult took him and poisoned him, irrevocably turning him to the dark side. Ulic continued to believe that he was doing the right thing up until the day when he joined Exar Kun and became one of the most terrifying Sith Lords in galactic history. Ulic almost succeeded in destroying the Republic and wiping out the Jedi Order, in fact, the order that his old master had honored. In the end, he was an accomplice to destroying the Jedi's homeworld of Ossus, and even murdering his own brother. It was only after his hands were covered in his brother's blood did he realize exactly what he had done. Dooku himself was a man who only wanted justice done by dissolving the Republic. Dooku was enraged at how passive the Jedi Order and their willingness to keep acting by a corrupt Senate. He only wished to have a society to return to a place of strength and order, to see the Jedi become protectors that they were always meant to be. But this incredible pride in his own powers, and Dooku's fascination with the dark side, was his ultimate undoing. Sidious enticed him by presenting to share his ideals. At first, Dooku pledged that he would not take part in killing Jedi, as the murder of his friend Qui-Gon Jinn had been the catalyst to him departing the Order. But by the end of the Clone Wars, Dooku was slaughtering them left and right, and mocking them while he did it. And of course, we have to mention Anakin Skywalker, who wanted to save his wife from a fate that befell his poor mother, only to be changed by his own entitlement and his lust for power. Or Luke's own student Kip Duran, who accepted the teachings of Exar Kun's spirit to take down the Imperial remnant who was on a destructive warpath. Kip was street smart and knew he was being manipulated. He pledged to not be another Darth Vader, but ended up exactly like him by not only betraying his friends, but by annihilating multiple star systems with the Sun Crusher, a super weapon that caused the deaths of thousands of Imperials and his own brother as well. And then of course we have Jacen Solo. Jacen, who sought to stop an impending future he foresaw by sacrificing himself and embracing the dark, a sacrificial lamb. Only instead, he went through justification after justification until he became the feared Darth Plagueis, a Sith Lord so twisted and evil that Luke actively believed he was worse than Darth Vader. We can keep going, but the point is, many good people and Jedi have attempted to use the dark side for noble reasons, only to become the worst kind of villain and Sith imaginable. It's a tale as old as time, so there's no arguing why Jedi doctrine is so strict about opening that gateway in any capacity. Unfortunately, they were so afraid of this occurrence that they established fence laws which caused an immense amount of anxiety within the members of the Jedi though. They would bar off all emotions, only allowing peace, compassion, and to be passive among their members. Feelings of anger and fear in their students were harshly rebuked. And because of this, many Jedi grew to be paranoid of their own feelings and emotions. And when they did stumble and let the floodwaters of their emotions out, they panicked and believed that their lives were over. This was purely because the Jedi forbid the study of the dark side in any capacity, because their students could hardly discern the right feelings from the wrong ones, and so when they felt anger within themselves or another being, all their alarm bells went off, believing it was the darkness. And this is likely what led to so many Jedi falling to the dark side during Order 66. They were told their entire lives that to give into anger was to go down a path that they could never return from. So when they were pushed to embrace their pain, they did so, believing that all hope was lost. There was no return, no redemption. But in the most ironic twist of the entire century, it was the Sith who would point out why this is absolutely ludicrous. Darth Plagueis and Count Dooku would be the ones to outline the differences between experiencing anger as a Jedi and actively choosing to embrace the dark side. Plagueis says it cleanly and clearly. A Jedi experiencing the dark side and a Sith embracing it are two completely different things. Propelled by fear or hatred, even a Jedi can pass beyond the constraints of the Order's teachings and discover power of a more profound sort. But no Jedi who arrives at that place, who has risen above his or her allegiance to peace and justice, who kills in anger or out of desire, can lay any real claim to the dark side of the Force. Their attempts to convince themselves that they fell to the dark side, or that the dark side compelled their actions, are nothing more than pitiful rationalizations. This is what the Sith embrace. They embrace the dark from the start, focusing on the acquisition of power. we make no excuses. The actions of a Sith begin from the self and flow outward. We stalk the Force like hunters rather than surrender like prey to its enigmatic whims. In simple words, Plagueis is saying that a Jedi can and have experienced a surge of power, allowing themselves to feel. But this is a cry from the actual powers of the dark side. Because they aren't used to the power that accompanies their emotions, Jedi often panic and lose hope, believing that they have crossed a line that they will never return from. Darth Sidious would exploit this belief when turning young Jedi to the dark side in the Empire. When Sidious discovered Jedi survivors, normally Jedi Padawans or untrained knights, he was fond of placing them in situations that forced them to give in to their anger, forcing them to commit a crime of some sort, usually murder. But they do it to save a beloved friend or a fellow member of the Jedi, or they do it out of survival or self-defense. It is their consciousness that does all the work in convincing them that they are guilty of a black-hearted sin. Sidious preys on these feelings and entices them to give up and embrace the dark side. In reality, their Jedi anger was nothing more than a welcome mat. Their hopeless guilt or lust for more power is what makes them cross over. Sidious details all of this in his book, The Book of Anger. He says this: even those with brightly burning passions, those who vow to resist with their dying breath, can be broken in 3 simple steps. First, they must be tempted. The strong-willed always have something they desire, or something they possess that they fear to lose. They will see their drive to protect this item as noble. By encouraging this delusion, a puppet is created. Second, the puppets must be tested. By creating an immediate danger or placing subjects in peril, they will be forced to make a decision. Crazed by fear and the mere thought of losing what they hold dear, they will do anything that is asked of them if only to preserve their most cherished desires. Third, they must be forced to submit. A moment will arise when they will take a step too far. In panic or fear, they will hurt others or commit a crime in such a way the outside world will never forgive. After that moment, there is no return from the dark side. Some who have been ensnared will choose to end their lives. Most, however, will accept their role as new warriors of the dark side. One life has ended, and a better one has begun. This is a massive deception that only the Sith know the truth of. They're the ones laughing at the Jedi, exploiting it for their own benefit. To hammer the point home, it is Dooku who is the one who fulfills Plagueis' explanation, speaking about the nature of the Sith's approach to aggressive feelings. In the Labyrinth of Evil, his thoughts go as follows: partnership with a Sith didn't make one a Sith. As the Jedi arts had to be taught, so too did the power of the dark side, and so began his long apprenticeship. The Jedi warned that anger was the quickest path to the dark side, but anger was nothing more than raw emotion. To know the dark side, one had to be willing to rise above all morality, to throw love and compassion aside, and to do whatever was necessary to bring about the vision of a world brought under control, even if that meant taking lives. Jedi believe that using any anger at all constitutes a path to the darkness, but the Sith refute this. Anger may indeed be a gateway, one of many, but truly embracing the darkness was something that needed to be taught. The Sith had techniques for unlocking greater power from within them, accessing the energies of the dark side. Nothing about learning the Force is intuitive. The Jedi should know this. That includes the dark side. It was to be practiced, honed, refined, repeatedly focused upon. Only that will bring them the kind of evil elevation that the Sith use. This fear does so much more to harm the Jedi than it does good, and the Sith are the ones that ridicule them for it. One may think that it's just because the Sith believe not using anger is weakness, but it's so much more than that. The Sith actively observing the Jedi treat anger like an irrational phobia, believing that so much as touching it will make them a dark side user, which is a lie, a joke. What Jedi need to understand is the concept of righteous fury. Anger is an emotion most associated with fire. Fire burns and destroys, but it can also warm and provide light. So too can anger be an illuminating agent, giving a person clarity on where the problem lie. A selfish anger will cause nothing but ruin. But when someone like a Jedi, a peacekeeper who is taught to experience great compassion, sees injustice, that may cause them to become furious on an innocent person's behalf. That anger instigates action, stopping the injustice and saving a life. In that way, the emotion is the kind of fire that provides warmth and light. Most importantly, protection. One of the reasons Revan became so powerful was because he understood this perfectly. In the Legends Revan novel, Revan reflects on his time being a Jedi, and then transitioning into a Sith, and then a Jedi yet again. Having experienced both sides of the Force, Revan sees where the Jedi fail and where the Sith fail, and in his writings, he states this: The Jedi Order opposed emotional attachments, believing that they were stepping stones to destruction. They taught that love begat jealousy, which led to the dark side. But Revan had seen its redemptive powers firsthand. It was his love that had brought Bastila back to the light, their emotional bond which had wrought salvation for both of them. Denying or attempting to utterly control emotion, Revan felt, was a fool's game. Jealousy was actually the result of ill-prepared Jedi being overwhelmed by feelings that they had never learned to face. Revan believed Jedi could be taught to use positive emotions like love and happiness to strengthen their connection to the Force in the exact same way that hatred and anger gave power to those that followed the dark side. And that is the revelation. It was said of the Rule of Two Sith that they had grown far more powerful than any Jedi. From the time of Darth Bane to the era of Darth Sidious, the Sith had been growing in power in secret for nearly 1,000 years. They altered their approach to conquest by integrating with Republic society and eventually controlling it from within. But this wasn't the only change that the Sith made. During our recent research of Darth Plagueis, we've come to discover that the Rule of Two Sith had advanced far beyond the Jedi in the realm of the Force. This isn't a claim that we throw out casually or lightly, however, because we aren't merely referring to the potency of a Force wielder, but rather their understanding, their wisdom over the Force itself. The Sith surrounding the generation of Plagueis exhibit abilities that the Jedi themselves never achieved. But this isn't just because the Sith were wielding the dark side, but rather, they looked at the Force a new way. They had taken universal abilities and brought them to brand new heights, far surpassing the powers of the Jedi. So my friends, welcome back to the archives, and let us begin. The Sith Lords of later generations always claimed that they had evolved beyond the Jedi. Tenebrous himself believed that they could show themselves to the galaxy, and that they could provide the Republic and the public at large with everything they needed, eventually causing the Republic to view the Jedi as completely obsolete. Even Sidious had insisted that the Sith had grown beyond the need for lightsabers, and only now used them symbolically rather than relying on them as a pure tool. Darth Plagueis was one of the opinion that the Sith were of the cusp of ascending to true godhood. Now, while a lot of this could be posturing on their part, there is a grain of truth to the fact that the Sith had indeed surpassed the Jedi in their understanding of the greater Force. It is a hard truth to swallow, but that is why we found evidence to support. And the greatest piece of evidence was the powers that Darth Plagueis could exhibit casually. Plagueis was an extremely rare, unique Sith. He had the capability to sense the very midichlorian count in other beings, and when he refers to this ability, Plagueis speaks of it as though it is old news, something that the Rule of Two had developed long ago. Unlike the Jedi, the Sith did not simply accept any pupil that proved themselves to be Force sensitive. They were much more choosy, and only wanted to find the strongest, and train them to be even stronger. Tenebrous had found Plagueis' father and mother, each of them showing many signs of potent Force sensitivity, and yet, Tenebrous chose not to settle, and instead manipulated the events for the two of them to interlink, and have them create an even more powerful child. That child would be Plagueis, a boy with the combined midichlorian count of his already highly Force-sensitive parents. This was just a single example of how the Sith will go out of their way to find, or in this case, to make only the strongest of apprentices. And a key ability in doing that was being able to literally perceive the midichlorians in other beings, and their exact count. The reason this is so important is because no Jedi has ever been able to do this in the history of their order, and to our knowledge, not even Grandmaster Luke Skywalker or the Jedi after him could do this. Luke had a method, and this was to use the Force to press on one's subconscious mind. Luke could discern whether or not they were Force sensitive if the person instinctively pushed back. And yes, Yoda had also been known to look into other beings and to sense their connection. And while it was technically possible for an experienced Jedi to divine whether or not one was strong with the Force, the Sith didn't just receive vague impressions on their sensitivity of a being. They could pinpoint exactly how many midichlorians per cell they had. And they could even accurately estimate their current power and their future potential. By the late Rule of Two era, the Sith saw the Jedi's electronic blood tests as archaic and clumsy, a symbol of their fading power. What's more, is that the Sith soon began to beat the Jedi at their own game. One thing that the light side always had an advantage over the dark was the ability of giving life. Force healing was always a power that came much more naturally to the Jedi. They could sustain themselves for long periods of time without mortal sustenance, or soothe the injuries of others. Skilled Jedi healers could even bring back those who were on the brink of death, though this was an intensive process. This power had always been elusive to the Sith. The dark side did not always lend itself to reconstruction and healing. The This was a power that traditionally required great compassion. With dark healing, though, it usually required an equivalent exchange. If a Sith wanted to heal themselves or another, it often came at a terrible price. And so for a while after this, the Sith would rely on alchemy, or they would use their injuries to fuel their power until they could find more conventional medicine. Even Darth Bane admitted to the powers of healing being beyond him, and the one advantage that the Jedi had over the Sith. However, dark healing was no longer an issue by Plagueis' era. During his contemplation and experimentation on life, Plagueis says that calling on the Force to mend ruptured arteries, torn muscle, or even broken bone was no more difficult than levitating slabs of stone. At this time, this was a fact of life that came so easily to Plagueis that he wasn't even satisfied with it. Plagueis wanted the midichlorians to cooperate with his nudging so that he could bring a being back to life at any request. But that shows the power of a being being able to literally mend organic bodies. This was little more than a convenience to the Rule of Two Sith, when it was once thought to be impossible. On the other end of the spectrum, the Jedi requires a team of skilled healers specifically dedicated to this one art form to perform feats even similar to this, and never on the scale. Not every Jedi could use Force Heal. As stated before, they could numb pain, soothe wounds, flush foreign toxins and diseases, and encourage life to run its natural course. But one often has to be gifted in healing in order to perform on the proficiency level even close to Plagueis. And again, he saw this as not being enough. The Sith had grown so far beyond the Jedi that they didn't even celebrate these new advancements in the Force. It was something that they had just come to expect as a fact of life. To use a power on a scale the Jedi could only dream of was the bare minimum, and the inability to ascend from this point was always met with frustration over contentment. Plagueis' focus on the midichlorians got to the point of being able to actually bend them to his will. He could persuade, prompt, cajole, and coax them into action, resulting in him discovering a new path towards healing, as he learned how to actually use the midichlorians to do so. It got to the point where he was able to kill someone and then bring them back to life as if it were nothing. This is what the novel says, but having gained the power to keep another alive hadn't been enough for him. And so after Sidious had returned to Coruscant, he had devoted himself to internalizing that ability by manipulating the midichlorians that animated him. For several months he made no progress, but ultimately he began to perceive a measured change. The scars that had grown over his wounds had abruptly begun to soften and fade, and he began to breathe more freely than he had in 20 years. He began to sense that not only were his damaged tissues healing, but his entire body was rejuvenating itself. Beneath the transpirator, areas of his skin were smooth and youthful, and Plagueis knew that eventually he would cease to age altogether. After not having seen his master for months, Sidious meets with him yet again, only to be shocked to find that Plagueis seems to have reversed his age. He no longer looked haggard and decrepit, but appeared to be 30 years younger. Now, of course, manipulating midichlorians is something the Jedi could consider to be unnatural, and they wouldn't go anywhere near abilities like it. But the point we wanted to bring to you is how the Sith had at least gone so far as to closely observe the movements of nature and the midichlorians themselves. And this finally brings us to the why the Sith got so advanced. The Jedi were content with not knowing the will of the Force, believing all aspects of the Force to be unknowable. They didn't bother picking apart their energy field that gave them power, but the Sith had begun to break down, to study the Force at its most basic elements. Plagueis, his master Tenebrous, and even Tenebrous' own Twi'lek master all fancied themselves as scientists of the Force. They encouraged experimentation of it, and were able to discover many new avenues to power. The Jedi, on the other hand, discouraged experimentation. They held the belief that tampering with the Force too much could lead one to the dark side through greed and obsession, but they never stopped to think or observe how much good could come from making new discoveries in the light side. They only studied what others had come to discover in the past, and rather than trailblazing new avenues of connection for themselves, they grew stagnant, while the Sith continued to advance. In this way, they remained extremely stagnant and even regressed in many aspects. In our opinion, the Jedi Order as a whole only started growing again when under Luke Skywalker's jurisdiction, because of the simple fact that he barely had any knowledge of what had come before. His teaching style heavily emphasized self-exploration, Anytime the students of the Praxium made a discovery, Luke encouraged it by supplying them with whatever scraps of knowledge they could find. And though not as knowledgeable as the old Jedi, the new Jedi Order were largely much stronger and more capable. And we believe that this is at least part of the reason why. The Force itself encourages growth. Its very nature is change, and the cycle of death and rebirth which leads to ultimate balance. The Sith sought to topple this cycle, to place themselves above it, which was an arrogant mistake on their part. However, their path towards their goal ironically led them to gaining a deeper understanding of the Force, allowing themselves to look at it much more closely. And eventually, this resulted in them evolving far beyond their light side counterparts. There came a moment in Darth Sidious's life where he felt uncompromisingly jealous towards his master, Plagueis. And this jealousy would end up changing the entire way that Palpatine approached his life as a Dark Lord moving forward. Greetings again, Acolytes and Lore Junkies, and welcome back to the Archives. The relationship between these two Sith was much unlike the typical master and apprentice dynamic that we see in earlier incarnations of the Rule of Two. They were more evolved. While Plagueis established himself as the superior of the two, he was raising Palpatine to be more like his partner, an equal, rather than a subordinate or an eventual successor. And by doing this, during the final years of Plagueis' life, the two would reach a point where they shared the Sith Lord title, and somewhat considered one another to be peers. Palpatine, of course, had absolutely no intention, though, of sharing his destiny with Plagueis, and was waiting for the moment that he could ultimately betray him. But this problem came when it seemed as though his master was simply untouchable, and there was a specific moment in the lore when Sidious had to acknowledge that he was envious of his master. So today, let's open up a new holocron and dive into this moment and how it changed Palpatine forever, as well as his identity as a Dark Lord. This occurred only months before the events of the Phantom Menace. A decade earlier, Plagueis had survived an attempt on his life by assassins, one that left him heavily reliant on a face mask simply to breathe. Plagueis would give up most of his double life as Higo Damask, retreat to the moon of Sojourn in order to devote all of his time to his studies into the midichlorians, his ultimate goal. He decided to continue manipulating galactic affairs from the shadows, but only operating through intermediaries, and of course his apprentice, Palpatine. Sidious, meanwhile, was on the front lines. He was a rising politician on Coruscant, quickly gaining popularity as he made his bid for the office of the Chancellor. Palpatine carried out most of Plagueis' will, concerning both politics and the Sith Grand Plan. It was Palpatine rather than Plagueis who was communicating with the Trade Federation, moving the pieces into place for the Naboo crisis to ultimately begin. For a while, Sidious had enjoyed his double life. He liked snaking around the shadows, pulling the strings on both politicians and Jedi. However, he began to feel it was a bit more of an inglorious post. Palpatine's pride was swelling within him, and he wished so sorely to show the galaxy what he truly was. He wanted people to know that he was a Sith Lord, to bow at his feet. So self-restraint was becoming a problem for Sidious. And not only this, but Sidious was beginning to feel like Plagueis' errand boy, more than his partner or even an apprentice. Palpatine was staying so busy that he couldn't really devote himself to his own studies in the dark side, while Plagueis got to swim in it in his isolation. However, things would change when Plagueis' enemies decided to group up with one another. A political enemy, Ars Varuna, a business enemy, Gardula the Hutt, and a criminal enemy, the Black Sun Syndicate. All of them joined together as one over their shared hatred for Higo Damask, the man who was secretly Darth Plagueis the Wise. Each group had, in some way, been cheated or done dirty by either Plagueis or Palpatine, and Palpatine had not seen this coming until it was revealed to him. But these three enemy groups launched a coordinated attack against Plagueis' stronghold world on Sojourn. Using nuclear weapons, they bombarded the surface and annihilated Plagueis' castle retreat. The Dark Lord, however, had used his network of spies to get informed ahead of time of the imminent attack. Therefore, Plagueis had managed to escape and met up with Sidious on Coruscant. Because of Plagueis' seclusion, this was the first time that Sidious had seen him in person for years. The two had mostly communicated via secret holograms and messages, and even then only sparingly. But when Palpatine saw his master again in his penthouse suite, he was astonished by what he witnessed. Plagueis was not the decrepit old man that Palpatine had seen him originally grow into. Because of his studies in the midichlorians, Plagueis had managed to reverse some of his own aging. Plagueis looked youthful and spoke with vigor. Palpatine even mentally commented that his master appeared decades younger, reminding him of when he had first encountered him all those years ago on Naboo. Before, Plagueis had appeared a bit crazed, paranoid, not to mention his powers and age had been taking a toll on his physical form, but his brand new appearance made him speak with boldness and power. No longer did he hide away from the galaxy, but he returned to help Palpatine carry out the Sith plan in person. The time was now, and all of Palpatine's hard work was about to pay off for Darth Plagueis. With strength in his voice, he vowed revenge against his enemies, and tactfully would carry it out. All of this had shocked Sidious to his very core. He had thought his master was breaking down, that he would be easy to eventually discard. But after meeting with Plagueis here, Sidious was musing as to why he had not sensed this attack beforehand. Sidious began to wonder if the dark side had blinded him for some reason, and if it had blinded him, why had it not blinded his master? In Palpatine's own words, his master surviving the attack on Sojourn made him appear almost omnipotent, and him showing up looking vigorous and youthful displayed just how far he had come in his research and powers in the Force. It was in this very moment that Palpatine had to suppress hidden feelings of envy. It fully registered to him that he had been wasting years of his life living a double life, doing all of the dirty work. Meanwhile, Plagueis got to luxuriously study the dark side in secret, in comfort. And now the power gap between the two of them had grown so far that Sidious wasn't even sure how far ahead of him his master really was anymore. Sidious wanted desperately to live purely as a Sith, but instead it was his master who got to fulfill his dream. Palpatine wanted his master's life, to shut himself away from the galaxy and delve into the dark side, becoming exponentially powerful in the Force, and of course, rapidly inching closer to the goal of sweet immortality. When he became the Emperor, Sidious would do this exact thing. He became a recluse and had his regional governors do a lot of the day-to-day running of the Empire, while he made most of the big decisions from behind the scenes, just like Plagueis. He rarely made public appearances, and what appearances he did make to the Senate dwindled as the years drew on. He threw himself fully into his research into the dark side. He made Vader and his Emperor's hands the agents of his will. And during that time, he searched ceaselessly for the secret to essence transfer. Palpatine even established all of the cloning tanks filled with his younger clones on the world abyss. And so he had, in a way, accomplished exactly what he was so jealous of his master of doing. He found a form of eternal youth, and got to grow his powers in the dark side to unprecedented levels. The only thing that Plagueis did not get to do was announce himself publicly as a Sith Lord. But as we've broken down in other holocrons, this was purposeful for keeping the Imperial citizens in line. After all, he had already gotten everything he had wanted. Every being knelt in fear, everyone cowered in his presence. However, he would forever be haunted by the memory of Plagueis. In The Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, we find Sidious musing about Plagueis years after his demise. Most fascinating of all, Sidious wondered what his master may say if he saw what Sidious had accomplished. He seemed to carry a bit of inferiority when he thought about the power and foresight that Plagueis commanded. Sidious was always prideful that he managed to supersede Plagueis' omnipotence by catching him off guard in his sleep. It was a great triumph for him. But it all had to do with Plagueis' accomplishments. He was a Sith who advanced the study of the Force further beyond anything that anyone had ever done before him, except for maybe the Ancients. And when commenting on Plagueis' research notes, Sidious states that he did not even fully understand his master's research yet, nor share his enthusiasm for the scientific process. Because of this, Sidious never mastered the art of manipulating the midichlorians the way that Plagueis did. That power was one of the only things that forever remained outside of Palpatine's reach, and he resented his master's memory because of it. Sidious was insanely clever, a master manipulator, but he was not the scientist that Plagueis was. There is actually an argument to be made that Plagueis was superior to Sidious in terms of intellect, that enabled him to touch powers that remained beyond even Palpatine's understanding. Palpatine's resentment toward Plagueis was rooted in more than just ambition. It was humiliation wearing the mask of patience. He despised his master's obsession with manipulating the midichlorians, a domain of power that even Palpatine could not grasp. Watching Plagueis heal himself, extend his life, and subtly enhance his strength was a constant reminder to the Moon's mastery of the Force was reaching a level that Palpatine had not yet matched. Plagueis' ability to hide himself away from detection, to vanish in plain sight, only deepened this wound. It meant that in the most dangerous arenas of Sith politics, his master could move freely while Palpatine remained in the open, visible, vulnerable. To a man obsessed with control, the idea that someone else could slip through the galaxy unseen was infuriating. Yet, what truly ate at Palpatine was the role that Plagueis had assigned him. For all his political cunning, all his power in the Force, he had become an errand boy, the servant, fetching, maneuvering, carrying out plans that ultimately served Plagueis. When his master spoke of them as equals, it was never genuine. Palpatine could hear the unspoken condescension in his voice. He could feel the truth lingering behind the compliments. He had surpassed his apprentice and was merely indulging him. The subtle yet constant reminder of his inferiority was intolerable. Palpatine understood the Rule of Two well enough to know that if he did not act, he would eventually become obsolete. In that awareness, every word that Plagueis spoke was one more nail in the coffin of a relationship that could only end in murder. There comes a time in every student's life when they witness the true, unfiltered expertise of the one who is teaching them. In the case of the Sith, this moment comes when the master must flex their full power in the dark side for the student to witness. In some cases, it's to put their apprentice in their place, or in other cases, it's because they have no choice in a life or death situation. It was for the latter reason that Darth Sidious would finally feel the true power of his own master, Darth Plagueis. For decades, the Moon Sith Lord had wisely kept his strength a secret, never showing more than what was necessary in order to train his young pupil. But there came a time when Plagueis had to throw all pretense aside to save himself from certain death. And when that happened, we get to see Palpatine's sober reaction to a power greater than his own. Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. In today's holocron, we will be revisiting the Darth Plagueis novel yet again in order to explore what happened after Palpatine felt the true strength of his master for the first time. One of my favorite moments in the entire novel. The event would come sometime in or around the year 52 BBY. Palpatine and his master, Higo Damask, the alter ego of Darth Plagueis, had garnered themselves some enemies during their political schemes. Those enemies were the Grand Protectorate of Malastare, a group that had been slighted by Plagueis one too many times. They had already sent a hit out on Palpatine which had failed miserably. But the hit they sent out against Higo Damask would be carried out with much more efficiency, and it nearly succeeded. The men sent after Plagueis were the Maladian Assassins, an order of warriors who took the art of assassination as a religious practice. They were known to always carry out their contracts, and had even wounded and been known for killing Jedi Knights. And while they had no prior knowledge of Damask being a Dark Lord of the Sith, they did not balk at the idea of fighting Force sensitives whatsoever. With their intense combat training and their ability to work together seamlessly, they were extremely formidable enemies, even for a Sith Lord. Higo Damask had been invited to attend a ceremony within the order known as the Canted Circle. This was a secret society made up of only the topmost elite of the entire galaxy. Plagueis himself was not an official member, however, as he did not want them digging too deeply into his past and his personal life. But because of his great influence, he was treated as an honorary member and was invited in some of their most important ceremonies. In this case, Higo Damask was attending the ceremony of his good friend Larsh Hill. Larsh, who had unwittingly done much to aid the Sith cause. Hill was being inducted into the Order of the Canted Circle. But this would be where Plagueis would get much more out of the evening than he originally bargained for. The Sith Lord would be tested in a way that he hadn't been in decades. Everyone wore ceremonial robes with hoods pulled up, as was custom for the secret society. But unbeknownst to all of them until the very last moment, the Maladian Assassins had infiltrated the Order of the Canted Circle, and had disguised themselves within the robes of their very members. During the ceremony, Plagueis felt the dark side wash over him like a wave, alerting him to the imminent danger. Rather than act on his instinct, however, Plagueis suppressed his impulse so as to not prematurely reveal his true nature. This would prove to be a fatal mistake, however. In an instant, the Maladian Assassins decapitated Hill and sent dozens of razor-bladed discs flying around the room. Almost every member of the Canted Circle, including the Sun Guard standing watch, were murdered instantly within a matter of moments. Plagueis of course managed to dodge, but because he had restrained his natural instinct and the indications that the dark side had alerted within him, a decapitator disc had made off with a considerable portion of the Moon's jawbone and his neck. This resulted in his trachea and several blood vessels being severed in the process. The assassins pulled vibroblades next, and proceeded to go around butchering anyone still standing. Plagueis, however, managed to somewhat heal his neck enough in order to keep from lapsing into unconsciousness. There was no use in his hiding his true nature now. He had to fight for his life. And so, the Dark Lord unleashed the powers of the dark side. Across the city in the Senate office, his apprentice Sidious was relaxing from his evening. He was still riled up from having nearly been assassinated himself recently, and at that moment, he was feeling some venomous things towards his master. He felt as though he was being denied secrets of the dark side that he was owed. He wanted to know when he would become the master. He began to wonder if Plagueis was keeping powers secret for himself, hoarding them away. It was just then that Saint Pestage burst into the room without warning. Saint Pestage is someone you may recognize as being a sycophant of Palpatine's, but before those days, he was simply one of many contacts that Darth Plagueis had. Yet, he was also one of a small handful of individuals who was aware of the Rule of Two and Damask and Palpatine's true nature. It was something that Saint Pestage kept on the down low and did not discuss with the two Sith Lords, but it was a silent understanding that they had between each other. Plagueis often trusted Saint Pestage with ordering the Sith's dirty work to be done, and some time back, Saint had also hired the Maladian assassins to take out a political enemy of Palpatine's. Unfortunately though, that mission went awry, and the assassination was botched. In humiliation of how the mission had gone, the Maladian captain felt that as penance, he would disclose some important information to Saint. Saint would then tell Palpatine that the Maladians were hired to kill someone affiliated with the Mask Holdings, and he had thought that that individual was Palpatine. Sidious, now fully armed, turned himself to the view window of his office, and opened himself fully to the dark side of the Force. It's worth noting that Palpatine was taught to suppress his nature in the Force by Plagueis. He had this natural ability to do so, but when he refined it, he was able to bury his own inner darkness so deep down that it could not be sensed even when he was in a room full of Jedi Masters. However, this came at the cost of his own perceptions and ability to use the Force, so he was often blind to the things happening around him until he actually opened himself up again. And when he did it this time, the power that he felt nearly took him off of his feet. This is what the novel reads. Palpatine paced away from Pestage. He opened himself fully to the Force and was left staggered by an inrush of overwhelming malevolence. He planted his left hand on the desk for support and managed a stuttering inhale. Somewhere close by, the dark side was unspooling. Despite being a Dark Lord himself and one of significant evil, Palpatine was left staggered by Plagueis' malevolence. That pressure and sheer presence of his master's power in the Force drove the air from his lungs and made him nearly fall over. Palpatine in this moment had several things running through his mind. Firstly, his master was in danger, and he had to run to save him. Not necessarily because he didn't believe his master could handle it, but because he had to make sure that the Jedi didn't get there first. Second though, he was taken aback by Plagueis' power. Long had Sidious wondered if his master was holding out on him. He had seen the Dark Lord's strange experiments, and knew that he had big dreams of controlling the nature of life and death itself. But as for how far those developments had come, Palpatine didn't really know at this point, and wouldn't know for about another 2 decades. Yet now one thing was for certain. Plagueis had been holding back, and he finally had felt proof of that. But rather than Palpatine fearing it, having anger or jealousy, he felt only awe, and later he would hunger to possess that same power. Palpatine and Saint rushed off to the Phobosi district of Coruscant, hoping that they were not already too late. Meanwhile though, Plagueis had already jumped to his feet and was snapping bones, smashing skulls, and punching straight through the chestplate armor of the assassins. This was Darth Plagueis, Dark Lord of the Sith. It didn't matter that one of his 3 hearts had already failed him. He was gushing blood from his neck. He would teach these lesser beings what they had made, and the last mistake of their entire lives. Every object in the room became a storm of deadly projectiles. Plagueis' Force lightning boiled the blood inside of their bodies. The Maladians, being professionals that they were though, did not shirk at the Force powers, but simply were forced to change tactics, coming at Plagueis from various angles and waiting for openings. Another of Plagueis' hearts would eventually fail here as well, nearly paralyzing him with pain. But the Dark Lord managed to throw up an impenetrable Force barrier and release a scream with his damaged vocal cords that shattered every eardrum in the vicinity. Another wave of power caused an earthquaking tremor in the floor, one that took the assassins off of their feet. And with a blast of raw power, Plagueis atomized the bodies of several more of the assassins, Starkiller style. Plagueis was moments from unleashing hell on his remaining attackers with what little energy he had left. That was when Sidious and Pestage entered the room. Sidious went to his master's side and aided him with his own powers in the Force. Pestage wielded a repeating blaster rifle that would lay waste to all of the stragglers. Within moments, the fight was over, and the 3 men were standing ankle deep in blood. Now that Pestage had witnessed their true natures without a shadow of a doubt, he was officially brought into the fold of the Sith. Sidious rushed to his master's side, told him that they had to leave at once, stating that he had felt Darth Plagueis through the Force and that the Jedi would have felt something similar. However, Plagueis was momentarily delirious from his loss of blood and fully enmeshed in the powers of the dark. To Sidious' statement, he said this in a raspy voice: "Let them come. Let them inhale the aroma of the dark side." In his aggravated state, Plagueis had more than a moment and forgotten the importance of secrecy. Having nearly died, he relished in the idea that the Jedi would be forced to walk through a toxic cloud of pure darkness, one created by his own power. But Sidious acted as the voice of reason, imploring his master once more. He said that the carnage around them was beyond explanation. They could not be there. And after a moment, Plagueis seemed to come to his senses and nodded in agreement with his apprentice. The two hurried out to escape the crime scene and to get Plagueis some much-needed medical attention. But while the Jedi would not be inhaling the aroma of the dark side this day, someone else would, the Grand Protectorate. And their fate would come at the now blood-raged hands of Darth Sidious. Sidious, who would carry out the judgment of him himself. The Rule of Two was the most radical transformation in Sith philosophy since the Order's very creation. Conceived by Darth Bane after he witnessed the self-destruction of the Brotherhood of Darkness, the Rule of Two declared that there could only ever be two Sith at any given time, a master who embodied the power of the dark side, and an apprentice who craved it. The cycle of succession through betrayal was designed to ensure that the Sith would grow stronger with each passing generation, distilling their knowledge and hatred rather than diluting it among countless rivals. By concentrating their secrets and ambitions into a single line of power, Bane believed that the Sith could avoid the chaos and arrogance that had doomed them in the past centuries. For 1,000 years, the Rule of Two forced the Sith into the shadows. They became patient conspirators instead of marauding warlords, operating as hidden architects of corruption rather than overt conquerors. Their secrecy was not a weakness, it was their greatest weapon. While the Jedi believed the Sith were extinct, the Rule of Two allowed each Dark Lord to train an apprentice in absolute secrecy, creating a lineage of increasingly cunning and powerful Sith. Over generations, this doctrine produced masters who were experts in deception, infiltration, and political manipulation, ultimately preparing the Sith to strike when the Republic was at its most complacent. It was precisely this hidden approach that allowed Darth Sidious to ascend. The Rule of Two taught him patience and the value of working from within rather than attacking openly. As a senator, then chancellor, and finally emperor, Palpatine exploited every weakness in the Republic while concealing his true nature. The discipline of the Rule of Two gave him a means to an end to corrupt Anakin, to engineer the fall of the Jedi, and to transform the Republic into the Galactic Empire. Though Palpatine would eventually come to see this rule as a temporary tool rather than a sacred tradition, it was this system that enabled him to fulfill the Sith's millennia-old dream of galactic domination. Sidious had been the culmination of it all. But this raises a question at the heart of the Sith philosophy. If Anakin Skywalker had truly had the potential to surpass every Sith Lord before him, even to destroy Palpatine himself, why would Sidious invest so much training in him? Why deliberately nurture a rival whose power could eventually eclipse his own? In today's Holocron, my friends, we're not only going to be answering this question, we will also be breaking down why Palpatine never fully trusted the Rule of Two, and how eventually he decided to completely discard it, and why. But before we open the Holocrons and listen closely, we have received a terrible vision. Many who are visiting the archives are not yet a part of our order, so if that's you, reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. The answer lies in the paradox that Darth Bane's Rule of Two was designed to embrace. According to this doctrine, the Sith should only grow stronger if each generation surpassed the last. For the line to evolve, the Master had to accept the possibility of being overthrown. This was not just a risk, it was the intended outcome. The apprentice's ambition, tempered by the Master's cunning, created a cycle of conflict that distills the Sith's power into its purest form. Sidious understood this principle better than anyone, and for much of his life, he would adhere to it, at least publicly. And yet, Palpatine's vision diverged from Bane's in a fundamental way. Sidious believed he could manipulate the cycle without ever falling victim to it. In his mind, Anakin's potential was both a threat and a necessity, a weapon too powerful to ignore. By molding Anakin from a young age, corrupting his attachments, and isolating him from the Jedi, Sidious believed he could channel the power without ever truly relinquishing control. And even if the day came when Anakin's strength could challenge his own, Palpatine planned to transcend death itself, to cheat succession and render the Rule of Two obsolete. In training Anakin, he was not only ensuring the destruction of the Jedi, but also proving to himself that he could master the system that had defined the Sith for 1,000 years. Palpatine thought of the Force itself, and the unnatural circumstances of Anakin's birth as presenting him with a rival, but a rival worthy of his ambition. The legend of the Chosen One, the prophecy of balance, and Anakin's unprecedented potential were in Sidious's eyes perhaps the Force's final countermove against the Sith's rise. Where lesser Sith Lords may have seen this as a threat to be eliminated outright, Palpatine saw it as a challenge to be mastered. This is where he differed from Darth Plagueis, who wanted the boy dead. But Palpatine saw a greater opportunity, a test of whether his own cunning, his knowledge of the dark side, and mastery of manipulation were truly limitless. In this sense, Anakin was not simply another apprentice. He was an existential obstacle, a living embodiment of destiny that seemed to promise the end of the Sith. But rather than shrink from that possibility, Palpatine embraced it with a kind of cold fascination. He believed that if he could bend Anakin's destiny to his will, if he could corrupt the Chosen One so thoroughly that the very prophecy would become an instrument of darkness, then it would prove beyond a doubt that his power eclipsed every Jedi and every Sith that had ever lived. Palpatine saw Anakin as the culmination of every prophecy, every experiment in alchemy, every ancient legend about beings born to reshape the galaxy, and whether he suspected the Force has created Anakin directly as a counterbalance, or whether he himself had unknowingly triggered the birth through Plagueis' experiments, Sidious recognized that Skywalker was no mere servant. He was a phenomenon, a singular event in the Force that could either destroy or immortalize the Sith. Yet for all of that, Palpatine was never intimidated by Anakin's potential. He believed his superior knowledge of the Sith lore, his mastery of deception, and his patient cultivation of Anakin's emotional weaknesses, that being fear, anger, and attachment, would keep the Chosen One in perpetual chains. Even as he praised Anakin's strength and flattered his ego, Sidious laid the groundwork to ensure that power was never truly turned against him. He exploited Anakin's love for Padme as both a lure and a poison. He isolated him from the Council, feeding his suspicion and pride. And he orchestrated the Clone Wars themselves as a crucible of violence and desperation, a perfect environment to breed a Sith Lord who would be grateful, broken, and utterly dependent. By the time Anakin knelt before him as Darth Vader, the idea that he could rise to challenge Palpatine must have seemed laughably remote. Even if he had escaped Mustafar unscarred, Sidious would have relied on more than simple loyalty to maintain control. He possessed the resources of a galaxy, an army, an imperial network of intelligences, the Inquisitors, hidden dark-side cults that proliferated under his reign. More than that, he had decades of hidden knowledge. He had access to ancient Sith techniques, alchemical rites, and forbidden rituals designed to break minds and to hollow out souls. In his view, these assets would be more than sufficient to subjugate even a being as powerful as Anakin. To Palpatine, Anakin represented not only the Force's ultimate challenge, but also final proof of his supremacy. If he could twist the Chosen One to his will, he would have conquered not just the Jedi or the Republic, but now destiny itself. That was the ultimate ambition, to stand above prophecy, to stand above tradition, all cycles of death and rebirth, to make himself the one true constant in a galaxy forever in flux. In this way, Palpatine's willingness to train Anakin was not done out of naivety, but it was the purest expression of his arrogance, the unshakable belief that no rival, no matter how powerful or preordained, could ever escape the gravity of his control. It is the most striking irony in Sith history that while Palpatine believed he alone had outgrown the Rule of Two, he ultimately fell into the very same trap that destroyed so many of his predecessors. Palpatine convinced himself the succession was a relic of weaker eras, something only lesser Sith needed to fear. He told himself that his mastery of the dark side, his knowledge of ancient secrets, his control over an empire made him immune to all betrayal. In that belief, he was not so different from his own master Plagueis. Plagueis had also been certain that he was the exception, that through his experiments in manipulating the midichlorians and conquering death, that he had risen above the vulnerabilities that plagued the Sith. He believed he was on the verge of achieving a form of immortality that would make apprentices completely unnecessary. Plagueis didn't even intend on originally training Palpatine. He simply viewed his appearance as a gift from the dark side itself, the same way that Palpatine would later view Anakin. Yet in the end, Plagueis died in his sleep, murdered by his own student. Palpatine's arrogance was merely an echo of this cycle. Like Bane before, like Plagueis before, he believed he had broken the pattern. But the Rule of Two was not just a system of succession, it was a reflection of a deeper truth. The dark side thrives on conflict. The more power a Sith gathers, the more certain it becomes that their apprentice will one day rise against them. Palpatine thought he could transcend that inevitability, and in the end, he only proved how inescapable it really was. Vader's own relationship with the Rule of Two was equally complex to his master. When he first embraced the dark side, he did so out of desperation to save his wife, to end the Clone Wars, to impose order on a galaxy plunged into chaos. He did not yet fully grasp that it was a Sith tradition. The apprentice's destiny was to one day overthrow their new master. But for years, Vader was consumed by self-loathing and regret. He served Palpatine less as a partner than as an instrument, a weapon wielded by a master who never let him forget his failures. But as the years wore on, the dynamic would shift. Though Vader's body had been broken, his spirit would gradually harden. He began to see that Palpatine did not truly respect him as any form of a successor. He was not being groomed to inherit a Sith legacy, but to serve as an enforcer until a better candidate could be found. This realization became clearest when Palpatine encouraged rival apprentices and dark-side agents to grow in power behind the back of Darth Vader. Palpatine would even encourage them to disrespect him. Individuals like Mara Jade would prove to be a real potential threat, so Vader would need his own plan. The most striking example was Starkiller, a secret apprentice trained by Vader. Starkiller was not just a contingency plan to assassinate the Emperor, he was a mirror held up to Darth Vader himself, a reminder that to Sidious, no apprentice was indispensable. When Palpatine discovered Starkiller's existence, he did not destroy him. Instead, he attempted to twist the situation to his own agenda, using Starkiller as bait to draw out hidden Jedi and to test Vader's loyalty. This cycle of manipulation and betrayal forced Vader to confront the truth of the Rule of Two. Vader began to recognize that the dark side demanded constant conflict, that an apprentice who never challenged the master was little more than a slave. By the end of his life, Vader no longer wished simply to serve. He contemplated overthrowing Palpatine not only to fulfill the ancient Sith tradition, but to finally claim the agency that he had been denied since Mustafar. In this way, Vader's story closed the circle that Bane set in motion. Even a master as cunning as Darth Sidious, who believed himself the culmination of all Sith ambition, could not escape the fundamental law that power invites rebellion. The Rule of Two was not a set of rules to be outgrown. It was a reflection of the dark side's truest nature, that in the end, there can only be one. But there is yet another dimension to Palpatine's intentions for Anakin, one rarely discussed in the histories of Sith. For all his proclamations of apprenticeship and destiny, Sidious almost certainly never intended to allow Anakin to rule the Empire as any equal. Instead, he saw Anakin as the culmination of centuries of selective breeding, alchemical experiments, and prophecy, a living vessel designed by the Force. And he knew this from the beginning. Palpatine viewed that vessel as a contingency for his own immortality. The technique of essence transfer, the ability to project one's consciousness into another body, was a secret long lost, even to masters like Darth Plagueis. Plagueis had dedicated his life to manipulating the midichlorians, to creating life and prolonging it unnaturally. But he never truly rediscovered the ritual that would allow his spirit to cheat death indefinitely. Sidious, however, was not bound by his master's limitations. Through years of clandestine research, he eventually uncovered this forbidden knowledge preserved in the holocron of Darth Endedu, an ancient Dark Lord who had sealed his consciousness into a hidden vault. And while Dooku served as Sidious's political instrument, he also provided crucial access to Sith archives, artifacts, and obscure histories through his own research and adventures. And after the fall of the Jedi and the Republic, it would be from these sources that Palpatine reconstructed the ritual of essence transfer, surpassing even the achievements of Darth Plagueis. This was the secret that made Sidious confident he would outlast any rival. He no longer needed to fear the decay of his own flesh, or the succession demanded by the Rule of Two. And in the figure of Anakin Skywalker, unburned, unbroken, and unimaginably strong in the Force, he saw not just a servant, but the perfect vessel. A body that could house his spirit unchallenged for centuries. Though he never spoke of these intentions aloud, his actions revealed the truth. Palpatine invested more in Anakin than anyone else. He destroyed the Jedi and the Republic to clear a path for the Chosen One's ascendance. he engineered Anakin's isolation and orchestrated his fall with the precision of a master alchemist, refining a singular, priceless material. And in the final hours of the Clone Wars, he did everything in his power to ensure Anakin would arrive at his side whole, ready, beginning to shape the galaxy. It is the greatest irony of all that his plan was undone not by prophecy or betrayal, but by the molten fires of Mustafar. When Anakin emerged from that crucible shattered, Palpatine's ambitions were forced to adapt. The perfect vessel was gone, replaced by a broken shell whose potential had been forever diminished. And so while Sidious continued to rule and scheme, he never again possessed the single ideal candidate to host his consciousness. Yet, this ambition to take the body of his greatest creation and inhabit it for all of time reveals the depth of his heresy. Where the Rule of Two demanded succession, Palpatine sought permanence. Where Bane taught that the apprentice must one day overthrow the master, Sidious planned to erase that possibility altogether. And in doing so, he demonstrated that for all his cunning, he had become precisely what Bane despised, a Sith Lord so intoxicated by his own power that he believed himself beyond the reach of history itself. Yet, while Bane's Rule of Two achieved what no Sith Empire ever could, survival and triumph over the Jedi, it ultimately contained the seeds of its own destruction. The system was never designed to create a Sith dynasty that would endure forever. It was meant to refine Sith power through conflict and succession, to ensure that the Order remained strong precisely because it never stopped evolving. Palpatine's greatest error was believing he could freeze that evolution. His conviction that he had outgrown the Rule of Two was not an expression of strength, but of hubris. In seeking to rule eternally, he rejected the very principle that had allowed the Sith to survive 1,000 years. He believed himself immune to betrayal, immune to consequence, immune to the Force itself. But the dark side always demands a price, and so the cycle that he tried to transcend finally claimed him. In this arrogance, he underestimated Anakin's capacity for redemption and Luke's refusal to surrender to hate. And when he was cast down the reactor core of the Death Star, it was not simply the defeat of a tyrant, it was the total collapse of a philosophy that had decayed into self-worship. Even that, though, was not the end. In the years that followed, Palpatine's clone body returned, defiant and unrepentant. He declared himself immortal, the living embodiment of the dark side, the unending will of the Sith. But in that end, even this resurrection was a hollow one. It was Luke Skywalker, the son of the apprentice Sidious believed he had forever broken, who would finally destroy him. The truth could not be avoided. No ritual, no clone, no hidden contingency could shield Palpatine from the same flaw that had destroyed all of the Sith before him. His arrogance was too vast to contain. His faith in his own invincibility was the most profound weakness of them all. In the final reckoning, Sidious was not the culmination of the Sith's triumph, but proof of their ultimate failure. He had proclaimed himself beyond the Rule of Two, the end of the old tradition and the first of a new. And in that sense, he was right. He was the last true Dark Lord of the Baneite lineage. He was the dark side's greatest champion, the ultimate expression of the Sith's ambition and their folly. But in believing himself above the cycle of master and apprentice, in imagining that he alone could stand unchallenged forever, Palpatine became exactly what the Rule of Two had been created to prevent. A master so consumed by his own power that he could no longer see the blade poised at his back. And so in the end, it was not the Jedi or the Republic or the will of the Force that undid him. It was the same thing that had always destroyed the Sith: hubris. The Duel of Fates is one of the most iconic moments in Star Wars. It wasn't just the climax of The Phantom Menace, it was the moment that defined Obi-Wan Kenobi's life, the return of the Sith to the galaxy, and the birth of a rivalry that would span decades. On Naboo, a single Padawan faced off against a Sith Lord raised since birth to destroy Jedi, and the impossible actually happened. Darth Maul, the apprentice to Sidious, slayer of Jedi Masters, the weapon forged in hatred, was defeated by Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was not even a Jedi Knight. The question has lingered ever since: how did a Padawan defeat a Sith Lord? The truth to this is layered. Obi-Wan did not outmatch Maul in strength, ferocity, or even skill. But through discipline, balance, and Maul's own arrogance, Obi-Wan seized a single moment and changed the course of the galaxy forever. To understand how Obi-Wan triumphed, we must begin with the fall of his master. Qui-Gon Jinn was no ordinary Jedi, a maverick, a seeker of the living force, and a warrior with decades of experience. Qui-Gon entered the duel with Maul confident. His chosen lightsaber form was a Taru, Form 4. The acrobatic style: it was fast, aggressive, reliant on fluid movement, precise, and above all, reliant on stamina. Ataru was designed to overwhelm an enemy with speed and agility, but it did have its weaknesses. Over time, it heavily taxed the user, and against an opponent like Maul who could sustain a relentless tempo, that weakness became a fatal one. Maul recognized it, trained since childhood as a weapon. Maul understood how to break an opponent piece by piece, and in the Theed hangar and through the corridors, Maul fought both Jedi at once. Using his double-bladed lightsaber to control distance and rhythm, he controlled the entirety of the duel. Where Qui-Gon pressed forward, Maul countered with ferocity. Where Obi-Wan darted with his youthful speed, Maul shoved him aside. The battle drove into the power generator complex, and there, Qui-Gon Jinn began to falter. Now separated from his Padawan, Qui-Gon's age, his reliance on bursts of Ataru's energy, this left key openings that Maul exploited. In a dirty trick, one that Darth Maul would later say he regretted using against a Jedi of Qui-Gon's caliber, he struck the Jedi Master in the face with his hilt, then impaled him through the midsection with his lightsaber, finally bringing the Jedi Master down. For Obi-Wan, watching his master fall was more than grief, it was a revelation. Obi-Wan saw the flaws of Ataru laid bare. He saw that offense could not withstand the fury of Maul. The lesson etched into him in blood would one day define the Jedi that he would become. When Qui-Gon Jinn fell, Obi-Wan's composure cracked. A surge of rage and grief overtook him. For most Jedi, this would mean disaster. For Anakin Skywalker though, the dark side was a fountain of strength. Anger empowered him, made him stronger, faster, more relentless. But Obi-Wan was different from his future Padawan. Obi-Wan's nature was not to seek power, but to seek peace. He was a warrior who didn't like to fight, a pilot who didn't like to fly. He was a contemplative Jedi, one who would rather meditate on the Force than send soldiers to their deaths. For Obi-Wan, the dark side did not empower him, it weakened him. When he gave into his anger, his discipline unraveled. His strikes against Maul became wild, furious, and aggressive. And in that moment, he fought with a strength he had never displayed before. He pressed Maul hard enough to shear the Sith Lord's weapon in half, in fact. But this was not sustainable. The dark side gave him only a fleeting burst. Maul, who thrived in the storm of rage, easily redirected it against him. With a calculated sequence, Maul disarmed Obi-Wan, kicked him into the reactor pit, and left him dangling, humiliated, defeated, and moments from death. This is the truth of Obi-Wan Kenobi. The dark side did not call to him as it did others. It stripped him of balance, clarity, and his real strength. To win, he would need something else entirely. There in the pit, the duel should have ended. Obi-Wan clung to the edge, unarmed, his life seconds from ending. Above him, Maul paced like a predator, savoring this moment, savoring his prey. But why didn't Maul strike the final blow? What made him wait? The answer lies in who Maul really is. Raised by Sidious not to conquer, not to scheme, but to destroy. Maul's entire identity was bound to testing himself against Jedi. Unlike Darth Vader, who would one day slaughter Jedi from across the galaxy out of duty and out of hatred, Maul was leashed. Sidious did not unleash him to purge. He kept him hidden, waiting, restrained. For Maul, every chance to face a Jedi was a rare, precious moment to be savored. And so Maul developed a habit. He gloated, he lingered, he basked in the Jedi's fear. He wanted them to know that they had failed before he struck the final blow. This was more than arrogance. Deep down, Maul hated the Jedi because once as a child, he had hoped that one might come for him, that they would somehow save him from Sidious, but they never did. To Maul, every Jedi was a reminder of abandonment, of hypocrisy, of saviors who never saved him. And so every duel became personal. Every gloat was not just about dominance, it was about vengeance. This is why Maul delayed. He wanted Obi-Wan to suffer, to see the terror in the eyes, to know the Jedi was powerless. Dangling there in the pit, Obi-Wan did not give in to despair. He centered himself. He remembered what he had seen. Qui-Gon Jinn's fall, the exhaustion of Ataru, the way Maul's ferocity shredded aggression. He understood, even in that very moment, that pure offense would never triumph over such an enemy as a Sith. And there, the seed of destiny was planted. Obi-Wan realized the truth. Where Qui-Gon had pressed forward, he would endure. Where Maul fought with fury, he would fight with patience. This moment birthed Obi-Wan's path towards Form 3, Surisu. Surisu emphasized survival, efficiency, and the conservation of energy. It was the form of the Jedi who outlasted, who waited for the enemy to overextend, and who turned arrogance into their downfall. Obi-Wan Kenobi became a master at preying on arrogance, and his teacher here was not Qui-Gon Jinn, it was Maul. The man who would outlast Grievous, who would defeat Anakin Skywalker's fury on Mustafar, who would survive Lord Vader. He was born in this instant of clarity. And then, the final moment arrived. Obi-Wan sensed the opening, the flaw in Maul's arrogance. He summoned the Force, pulling Qui-Gon's lightsaber directly into his hand, and with a surge of clarity, he flipped from the pit in one smooth motion. Maul, caught unprepared, swung too late. Obi-Wan landed, struck, and cleaved the Sith Lord in two. It wasn't strength that won the duel. It wasn't fury or even skill. It was timing, clarity, and discipline. Obi-Wan had balanced himself, seized the moment, and turned Maul's arrogance into his defeat. So why did the Padawan defeat the Sith? Not because Obi-Wan was stronger, not because he was faster, but because he understood balance. Because where the dark side weakened him, the light steadied him. Because where Qui-Gon's aggression faltered, Obi-Wan adapted. And because of Maul's arrogance, rooted in his own tragedy, gave him this opening. This duel was not just Obi-Wan's first victory, it was the crucible that forged him into the Jedi that he would become. The greatest master of Surisu the Jedi Order had ever seen. He became the Jedi that endured, the Jedi who survived the rise and fall of the Galactic Empire. The duel on Naboo was not the end of Darth Maul though either. Cut in half, cast into the abyss, he survived. His body broken, his mind shattered, but hatred keeping him alive. The flame not put out. In that pit, Maul lost not only the battle, but the balance in his own life. The balance that he thought that he believed in. The tragedy of Maul is that he never learned. He never grew beyond the mistake that had undone him here. Time and time again, he fell to the same habits, gloating, prolonging the fight, savoring his enemy's fear rather than finishing them. He clung to rage, unable to let go, unable to forgive the galaxy, the Jedi, or himself. Where Obi-Wan found clarity, Maul only deepened his obsession. To Maul, Kenobi was not just the man who defeated him on Naboo, he was the thief of destiny. Obi-Wan became the symbol of everything Maul had lost. His victory, his place at Sidious's side, even his purpose. And so, Maul spent his life trying to undo that singular moment, never realizing that it was his own arrogance, not Obi-Wan's strength, that sealed his fate. He could never see the shortcomings of his master Sidious, nor the prison of the Sith path that he had chosen. He could never free himself from the need to dominate and to prove, and so he resigned himself to a life in service of the dark, forever repeating his same downfall. When he finally faced Obi-Wan on Tatooine decades later, nothing changed. Maul struck with fury, Obi-Wan countered with patience, and once again balance overcame arrogance. In the end, Maul died as he had lived, consumed by the same mistake that defined him on Naboo, that downfall. And that is the final truth of the Duel of Fates. It did not only forge Obi-Wan into the Jedi of balance, it revealed the flaw in Darth Maul that would haunt him forever. One man learned and endured, the other would never let go. We need to be clear though, when Obi-Wan struck down Maul on Naboo, it was not a triumph of sheer martial superiority. Obi-Wan did not overwhelm Maul through superior technique, speed, or power. Instead, he capitalized on a fleeting moment of arrogance, a flaw that haunted Maul his entire life. Obi-Wan's victory came not from being the greater warrior, but from being more centered in that single instant. Hanging on the edge of the reactor shaft, he found clarity where Maul lost his discipline. It's important to emphasize that at this point in time, Obi-Wan was not a greater duelist than his master Qui-Gon. In fact, Maul himself noted after their clash on Tatooine that Qui-Gon Jinn was the finest duelist that he had ever encountered. What impressed Maul so much was not simply Qui-Gon's blade work, but his composure, his ability to remain steady even under the punishing heat and shifting sands of Tatooine. Maul had expected to exploit that environment, only to find Qui-Gon unmoved by it. For all his relentless training, Maul respected Qui-Gon's poise in battle, a recognition that makes it clear who truly stood above Obi-Wan at the time. The duel on Naboo was not defined by Maul's lack of skill. His technique was flawless, his movements as fluid and precise as any Sith assassin could have hoped to achieve. What undermined him was his arrogance, his tendency to prolong the fight and to savor domination rather than end it with finality, unlike Dooku, whose precision allowed him to close engagements with merciless efficiency, or Vader, whose crushing ferocity left little room for survival. All toyed with his prey. In doing so, he denied himself the very victories his training demanded. Obi-Wan did not outclass him in form or ferocity, but in that one heartbeat where discipline met overconfidence, and Obi-Wan seized the moment. In the galaxy far, far away, there are countless weapons, each forged in the crucible of conflict and refined across millennia. Blasters and thermal detonators, disruptors, and vibroblades, all tools for destruction in a turbulent universe. But no weapon has ever rivaled the elegance, the symbolism, and the mystic status of the lightsaber. For the Jedi, it was the physical manifestation of discipline, serenity, and the connection between the living force and the wielder's will. For the Sith, it was an instrument of dominance, a weapon not merely to defend, but one to conquer. Yet among all the storied lightsabers of history, one stands apart: the crimson blade carried by Darth Vader, the weapon that, more than any other, became synonymous with fear, tyranny, and the unstoppable martial prowess of a Sith Lord. But to understand Darth Vader's lightsaber fully, we must first understand the young man who built it, not in the darkness of the Death Star, but in the fires of the Clone Wars, a boy whose brilliance with machines and weapons evolved into an obsession, a Jedi Knight who refused to be limited by tradition, even as the Council looked on it with disapproval, a warrior who never believed that the Force alone would save him. This is the story of how Anakin Skywalker's philosophy of the blade survived the fall to the dark, and how Darth Vader's lightsaber became the ultimate expression of that obsession. Long before he ever became Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker was recognized by his fellow Jedi as one of the most naturally gifted warriors the Order had ever seen. But Anakin's brilliance extended far beyond combat. From his early days as Obi-Wan's Padawan, Anakin exhibited an almost supernatural skill with machines and engineering, only that could be explained by the Force. He could reassemble a hyperdrive in hours, fine-tune a pod racer's repulsor lift turbines, and repair droid processors from scraps. This mechanical intuition naturally carried over to his lightsaber construction as well. For many Jedi, assembling a lightsaber was a rite of passage performed only a single time. It was done during their journey to Ilum, but for Anakin, this was only the beginning. Anakin did not see the lightsaber as a static object or an artifact to be revered. He saw it as a work in progress. He saw it as a machine that was to be constantly refined and upgraded to better serve his style. And in the years leading up to the Clone Wars, Anakin went through multiple iterations and experiments with his lightsabers, deducing which power cells he wanted, focusing crystal assemblies, and emitter matrix configurations. Some masters of the Order found this eccentric, others found it disrespectful. The Jedi had always been taught to embrace simplicity and humility, but Anakin believed the weapon must be as dynamic as the warrior that was going to wield it. When Anakin settled on a design for a lightsaber, the blue-sated weapon that he would carry into the Clone Wars, it already bore traces of his personal philosophy. The grip was slightly larger than the standard hilt Jedi weapon, designed to give him greater leverage when applying torque in heavy strikes. The power cell was also calibrated to produce a blade of marginally higher density and cutting efficiency, compensating for the heavier two-handed strikes characteristic of Form 5. But it was not merely technical innovation that set Anakin apart. It was his conviction that mastery of the blade itself could overcome any challenge, a conviction that would one day cost him dearly. And that day would come a lot sooner than he anticipated: the duel with Dooku and the birth of obsession. In the vast torchlit hangar on Geonosis, Anakin Skywalker learned one of the most painful lessons of his life. Facing down Count Dooku, the newly revealed Dark Lord of the Sith, Anakin's aggression and confidence were matched by Dooku's decades of experience and impeccable technique. Dooku was a master of Form 2 Makashi, the dueling form, a style designed precisely to counter and dismantle more kinetic styles like Anakin's, at least at this point where he was still utilizing Xian. It was here, as Anakin charged with his signature power blows, that Dooku demonstrated the price of underestimating refinement and discipline. With a single precise cut, Dooku severed Anakin's arm just below the elbow. The pain to him was blinding, but the true wound was to Anakin's pride and his certainty. In this instant, his resolve that no opponent could ever best him was easily broken. This is where the obsession began, rooted in fear, shame, and the desperate need to be in control. And when the Clone Wars erupted across the stars, Anakin would find countless opportunities to test, refine, and prove the power of his new weapon. As the war progressed and Anakin constructed his second lightsaber, Anakin's weapon would undergo significant refinements. He began to incorporate micro adjustments to the emitter lens and energy modulation circuits to achieve a blade that was fractionally faster to swing and slightly more resistant to contact than other lightsabers. His chosen combat style, Gem-So, evolved in parallel. Gem-So was an adaptation of Form 5 characterized by powerful counterattacks and an unrelenting offense. This was a style born of frustration with the defensive Surisu, the style favored by Obi-Wan. Where Sirisu focused on the attrition and control of a duel, Gemso embraced dominance and momentum. In turn, the High Council took note of Anakin's increasingly aggressive tendencies, both in his dueling and in his tactics on the battlefield. Some Jedi whispered that his lightsaber was a symbol of his growing darkness, heavier, more forceful, designed to batter opponents into submission. But Anakin refused to apologize for this approach. To him, the blade was not just a weapon. The blade was proof that skill and willpower could triumph over dogma. Throughout the Clone Wars, members of the Jedi Council expressed concern over Anakin's lightsaber modifications. First, they argued that the longer grip was a liability, more difficult now to control in confined spaces, and potentially susceptible to disarming maneuvers. Second, the enhanced power output and the increased plasma density now posed the risk of overheating the internal components during prolonged duels. Third, and most importantly, they felt that Anakin's approach represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be a Jedi. Where most Jedi built their lightsaber to be a reflection of serenity, Anakin had built his as a reflection of power. Where others were content to rely on the Force to guide their blade, Anakin sought to engineer the weapon itself to give him an advantage. These critiques did not do much to dissuade him though. If anything, they all cemented Anakin's belief that the Order was shackled by outdated traditions, and that true mastery demanded innovation, even if it meant breaking the rules. But now came the fall. When Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, much of his past was stripped away. His rank, his name, his place in the Order. But not this conviction, not his belief that the blade was the truest measure of any warrior. The final duel on Mustafar against Obi-Wan left Vader mutilated and broken. The lava scorched his body beyond recognition. His connection to the Force was forever diminished by the agony of cybernetic life support. And yet, this obsession with the lightsaber endured. When he awoke in the med center of Coruscant, encased in the iron lungs, in black armor that would become legend, Vader faced the practical problem of arming himself again. According to some accounts, Palpatine provided him with one of his spare lightsabers in order to study, instructing his new apprentice in the construction techniques of the ancient Sith. Although the Emperor didn't really care about lightsabers whatsoever when it came to himself, he preferred a more ritualistic approach in forging weapons, attuning them through dark side incantations, and imbuing them with alchemical processes. But Vader approached this object with the same meticulous pragmatism that had defined his life as a Jedi. He had studied the designs that Palpatine provided, but he also drew on the very lesson from the Clone Wars, from the failures that had cost him his limbs. Even in this moment of transformation, when any other Sith Lord would have seized the opportunity to create a weapon symbolic of their rebirth, Vader was different. He retained many of the core design philosophies from his Jedi lightsaber, because in his mind, those designs were not flawed. He was flawed. The blade had never failed him. And so when Vader constructed his new lightsaber, this time ignited with a synthetic red crystal, it bore a familiar silhouette. The hilt retained a slightly larger grip diameter and a similar emitter matrix assembly. When he presented it to his master, Sidious was not pleased. To the Emperor, Vader's decision was a mark of sentimentality, an inability to sever all ties with his past identity. The Emperor critiqued the weapon, calling it too similar to Anakin Skywalker's. But Vader was unmoved by any of these criticisms. The weapon was not a nostalgic indulgence, it was the most effective design that he knew. He had been reforged into something monstrous, but the blade remained the perfect expression of his skill, his will, and his desire never to be powerless again. To understand why Vader retained so much of Anakin's engineering, it helps to look at the specific components, his hilt grip and its length. The hilt was longer than standard, designed for two-handed power blows and enhanced torque. This length allowed Vader to generate tremendous force despite his prosthetic limbs. The emitter retained a hybrid focusing lens capable of stabilizing the higher density plasma channel that he had favored. This design improved cutting power, especially against armored enemies, but at the cost of increased energy consumption. But one of the most fascinating aspects of Vader's Sith weapon was the inclusion of a secondary focusing crystal. Unlike a dual-phase saber, which changes blade length via telescoping components, Vader's design modulated the phase of the plasma itself. This was a rare feature even for Sith. It allowed Vader though to lengthen or shorten the blade on command, adjusting the reach in real time during a duel. Given the higher power output and the synthetic crystal's instability though, the hilt included reinforced power conduits and additional cooling vents. All of this added in order to prevent meltdown during extensive duels. These choices were not made for aesthetic reasons. Every decision was dictated by function. To Vader, the blade was a means to an end, an expression of dominance over every enemy who would ever stand before him. The blade was forged in the shadow of the Death Star, Another detail often overlooked is where the lightsaber was built. In the earliest months of the Empire's formation, while the galaxy was still reeling from Order 66, construction had now begun on the Death Star. The Emperor was determined to create an ultimate weapon, a monument to the Sith's final victory over the Jedi. In this environment surrounded by engineers, slaves, and Sith loyalists, Vader designed and constructed his saber. It is said that the first activation of the blade took place in the same vector where the super laser was now being assembled. The symbolism was unmistakable. A weapon of personal annihilation forged alongside a weapon of planetary annihilation. And while Sidious was consumed with overseeing this grand project, Vader was equally consumed with perfecting the single instrument that mattered most to him. When Vader presented the completed saber to his master, Sidious voiced disappointment. He had hoped that Vader would embrace Sith tradition fully, crafting a weapon that reflected his birth and form as well as function, a saber that would symbolize the final death of Anakin Skywalker. Instead though, the design retained too many similar contours. The lines were clean, industrial like the Jedi weapons that he had carried in the Clone War. Sidious considered this a mark of Vader's lingering attachment to the past. He accused him of sentimentality. He accused him of weakness. But what Sidious could never understand was that Vader did not cling to the past because he missed who he had been. He clung to the past because it was efficient, effective. The blade worked, and that was all that mattered. When Vader finally confronted Obi-Wan again on board the Death Star, it was not merely a rematch of rivals, it was a confrontation layered with memory, resentment, and unspoken fear. One of the most striking details during this duel is the apparent length of Darth Vader's blade. The plasma channel appears visibly longer than in later encounters, especially when compared to the duel on Bespin. Some may dismiss this as a production inconsistency, but in lore, there is actually an explanation. Vader deliberately extended the blade to keep Obi-Wan at a greater distance on the Death Star. Even after years of honing his skill, Vader remained apprehensive of his former master's prowess. Obi-Wan had defeated him once, and Vader would not risk being drawn into close quarters maneuvers that had cost him everything on Mustafar. By extending the blade length, he created a buffer zone, a space where he could dictate tempo and range. This was the practical expression of the dual crystal assembly, a feature he had incorporated precisely for this kind of tactical advantage. Vader's life support armor posed unique challenges to lightsaber combat. The enhanced strength of his prosthetics, though, allowed him to wield the saber with tremendous force, but the suit's bulk limited mobility and reduced finesse. To compensate, Vader adjusted his style to rely on sweeping, powerful strikes. The longer grip and heavier hilt gave him the leverage needed to maintain pressure without exhausting the suit's servos. This style was often mistaken for clumsy by his enemies, especially Order 66 survivors, but in truth, it was a deliberate adaptation, one that took full advantage of his mechanical strength while conserving energy. Many of the Sith Lords in the Rule of Two before Vader had ultimately turned away from the lightsaber as their primary instrument of power. Plagueis had become obsessed with the manipulation of midichlorians. Darth Sidious preferred intrigue, manipulation, and rituals. But Vader never abandoned the blade. Even after becoming more machine than man, even after immersing himself in the dark side, he retained an unshakable belief that true victory was won in the duel. To Vader, the Force was an ally, but it was the lightsaber that proved supremacy beyond question. No deception, no illusions, only skill and will, measured in inches of plasma. This was not merely a practical choice, it was the final expression of Anakin Skywalker's lifelong obsession, the belief that if he perfected the blade, no one could ever take anything from him again. Throughout the Imperial era, Vader's lightsaber was a source of myth and terror. To the surviving Jedi in exile, it was a reminder that their order had fallen. To the Imperial hierarchy, it was the emblem of the Emperor's enforcer, a red blade that meant death to any who defied the new order. Yet for Vader, the weapon had a more personal meaning. It was the only thing that truly belonged to him. His body was a prison of durasteel and synth skin. His will was bound to the Emperor's command, but the blade was his, crafted by his own hands, tuned to his own specifications. And while Palpatine hoarded holocrons and relics, Vader spent countless hours maintaining and refining his lightsaber. He adjusted power regulators, recalibrated the emitter, and even experimented with different synthetic crystal compositions in order to achieve the precise balance that he preferred. This ritual was quiet, methodical, intimate. It was the last connection of the man that he had once been. The act of building and rebuilding the blade was an echo of Anakin Skywalker's ingenuity, and no matter how much he tried to bury that identity, it refused to die. It's telling to consider how Vader's philosophy of combat stood in contrast to other Sith Lords. To Dooku, it was an extension of aristocratic finesse. His Form 2 style was elegant and precise. To Maul, it was about reveling in the ferocity of Form 7, channeling rage into acrobatics and an overwhelming offense. Vader stands in contrast. He committed himself fully to the lightsaber not out of tradition, but because he believed it was the most honest expression of dominance. Where Sidious prized secrets and contingency orders, Vader placed his faith in the one true skill that he had always trusted, the duel. While there is irony in the fact that Vader is one of the most powerful dark side wielders that have ever existed, he never abandoned his dependence on the lightsaber. Many Sith scholars and chroniclers speculated that the reliance reflected an insecurity, an unconscious admission that he no longer trusted the Force alone to sustain him. But this interpretation ignores a deeper truth, that Anakin Skywalker had never been content with surrendering his fate to mysticism, to the Force. Even as a Jedi, he resented the idea of passive submission to the will of the Force. He believed in shaping his own destiny through action, through mastery of every skill and every tool. In the end, the red blade was not merely a crutch, it was a statement. A declaration that no matter how many times the galaxy tried to break him, he would rise again and again, blade in hand. It was his will to impose. When Luke Skywalker finally confronted Vader on Bespin and again aboard the second Death Star, he faced a weapon honed over decades of war, defeat, and a dark purpose. The duels between father and son were more than battles for survival. They were contests of philosophy. Luke Skywalker's green blade was a symbol of hope. The next generation was rising to challenge the sins of the old. Vader's blade was the culmination of Anakin's obsession, reforged through hate, loss, and regret. Even in their final duel, Vader continued to rely on the lightsaber as the ultimate expression of who he was. And in the end, it was only when Luke cast his own blade aside that he showed Vader a different path, the choice to be something more than a weapon. When we look back at the saga of Darth Vader's lightsaber, it is tempting to focus on the technical specifications alone, and indeed, by every measure, the weapon was a masterpiece. A heavier hilt for leverage and power, enhanced plasma density for cutting armored foes, a dual crystal modulation for variable blade length, reinforced conduits and cooling vents for sustained engagements. It was a superior weapon far ahead of many of its contemporaries, but its true significance lies deeper. For all of the Emperor's criticisms, for all of the Council's warnings, for all of the suffering that Vader endured, the lightsaber was the one thing that never betrayed him. It was the tool he relied on to carve his own path through the galaxy, to defend himself against Jedi, to enforce his master's will, and to confront the ghosts of his past. And perhaps most telling of all, it was the single artifact that he never truly let go of. Even as he fell to the dark side, even as he embraced the mantle of a Sith Lord, Vader never abandoned the one lesson that had driven him since that day that Dooku severed his arm, that the blade was always the truest expression of power. Darth Vader's lightsaber stands as a testament to a lifetime of obsession, innovation, and unrelenting will. From the battlefields of the Clone Wars to the cold corridors of the Death Star, from the shadow of the Emperor's throne to the final moments with his son, the weapon remained the one constant in a life defined by conflict. Where others sought answers in prophecy or rituals, Vader placed his faith in the perfection of the blade, a weapon that could be refined, understood, and controlled. And in the end, that choice tells us everything we need to know about Anakin Skywalker and his transformation. For although he wore the mask of Vader, beneath it beat the heart of a warrior who believed that mastery, real mastery, was forged in the crucible of the duel. Mustafar, Palpatine's vision for the perfect Sith heir, was shattered, but he didn't wait to lick his wounds. He moved quickly, activating every darkside asset that he had cultivated in secret for years. One of his first measures was to expand the Inquisitorius. These were the fallen former Jedi who had broken under torture or been seduced by promises of power. Trained in lightsaber combat and specialized to hunting Order 66 survivors, the Inquisitors were effective, but in the Emperor's eyes, they were little more than expendable hounds. They were never given access to the true teachings of the Sith and to true dark power. Then there were the dark side adepts of the world of Biss, fanatical cultists and scholars of forbidden lore. They gathered in hidden citadels to study Sith alchemy and ancient rituals. They wore black robes and carried red blades, but none of them ever stood before Sidious as a true apprentice or even close to an equal. They were a priesthood of darkness, useful, but ultimately beneath the Emperor's ambition. Among the other shadows, however, one figure stood out as something more formidable, something special. Jarek had once been a respected Jedi Master, renowned for his archaeological knowledge and hunger for forbidden truth, but after he fell to the dark side, he became one of Palpatine's most loyal and powerful agents. Blind, but still able to see through the Force itself, Jarek commanded a cadre of dark Jedi and plotted to uncover the Valley of Jedi, a place rumored to hold unimaginable power. He was not content to remain a subordinate to Sidious. Unlike the other Inquisitors, Jarek actively dreamed of overthrowing both Sidious and Vader. In his private musings and secret councils, he spoke openly of seizing the Valley's energy to elevate himself beyond any Sith who had come before. But it's important to draw a distinction here. While Jarek's power was undeniable, and while his ambition was vast, Palpatine himself never seriously considered elevating Jarek as a Sith apprentice. In the Emperor's mind, Jarek was a tool to secure ancient knowledge and destroy Jedi enclaves, but not a candidate to inherit the Rule of Two. Jarek's aspirations were tolerated only because they were aligned in part to the Emperor's own interest. To Sidious, these figures, the Inquisitors, the Adepts, and even Jarek were all ultimately lesser instruments, powerful enough to terrorize the galaxy, but never worthy enough to sit on any throne. Yet, they set the stage for the next echelon of contenders. Those whose service to Palpatine took a different form, blending shadow warfare with absolute loyalty, and among them was an agent who in Vader's eyes embodied everything that he despised. When Anakin fell into the lava on Mustafar, it was more than the destruction of a body, it was the end of a grand vision. For decades, Sidious had orchestrated a campaign of deception, betrayal, and war, all for one singular purpose: to claim the galaxy and to forge the perfect Sith dynasty. Anakin was not just another apprentice, he was the chosen one, an anomaly in the Force whose midichlorian count surpassed any being in recorded history. From the moment he met the boy from Tatooine, Palpatine knew that if he could mold him, no Jedi or Sith could ever rival their power. But it is important to remember that Palpatine's ambitions were never limited to just a single candidate. Even before Anakin's fall, he had studied the potential of countless others. In Legends, Palpatine quietly considered whether Maul, if he had survived, could be elevated further. During the Clone Wars, he kept Dooku close, never fully trusting him, still holding on to the possibility that Dooku was incredibly useful, admirable, and powerful. Sidious even maintained secret files on Force-sensitive children, potential assets that he could one day mold into servants, or even a successor. All of this is to say, when Anakin was crippled, it did not end Sidious's plans. It merely forced him to accelerate his contingencies. According to Legends, the Emperor was disgusted in the early years with Vader. He considered Vader crippled, a tragic disappointment, far less than what he had invested decades to create. Yet, even in this disgust, he never gave up on the idea of shaping the perfect Sith heir. He simply began the process yet again, searching for new instruments to realize the destiny that Vader had failed to fulfill. Beyond the Dark Enforcers and fallen Jedi, there were other figures who served the Emperor in more subtle ways, operatives who combined Force sensitivity with absolute loyalty. Chief among them was Mara Jade, known across the Empire as the Emperor's Hand. Mara Jade was different from the Inquisitors. She wasn't a hunter of Jedi by profession, nor a commander of a dark side cult. She was an infiltrator, an assassin, a whisper in the darkness who could reach any corner of the galaxy. Mara Jade possessed a rare telepathic link to the Emperor himself. Through this connection, she received his instructions without any intermediaries, and in many ways, she was more personally trusted than almost any other Imperial servant. What made Mara Jade's relationship with Palpatine so remarkable and so dangerous in the eyes of others was the way that Sidious deliberately encouraged her to believe that she could be something greater. On more than one occasion, Sidious praised her skill in Vader's presence, deliberately provoking tension between them. He would commend her efficiency, her obedience, her subtlety, all the qualities he felt that Vader had long since abandoned in favor of brute, overwhelming force. In private audiences, Palpatine sometimes implied that if she continued to grow in power, her destiny might eclipse the role that she currently occupied. It was no accident. This was classic Sidious, pitting his servants against each other to sharpen their ambition and to fuel their dependence on his approval. To Mara, these moments of recognition were intoxicating. They fueled her sense of purpose and her belief that she could one day be a greater role in the Empire. But to Vader, they were nothing but mere theater. In Vader's eyes, Mara was an irritant, a clever agent who believed herself indispensable, yet lacked the power to ever threaten him directly. Vader understood the game that the Emperor was playing with Mara. He knew Palpatine would never truly replace a Sith Lord with an assassin, no matter how skilled she was, and that knowledge only deepened his contempt for her. Mara Jade's special status was in the end a tool, a way to keep her loyal, a way to remind Vader that even after Mustafar, the Emperor's power over his servants was absolute. No matter how much Palpatine praised her, she remained an instrument, never a successor. But among all of Palpatine's machinations, there was one apprentice who was not merely a pawn or a distraction, one who was trained in secret to become the heir that Vader had failed to become. Among all the dark side adepts and secret enforcers who served the Empire, there was perhaps no figure more enigmatic or more complicated than Lumaya. Born as Shira Bree, she came into Palpatine's service not as a Sith acolyte, but as an exceptional intelligence operative. Recruited into Imperial intelligence, and then personally groomed at the Imperial Academy at Karida, Shira proved herself to be resourceful, fearless, and utterly loyal. By the time she came to the Emperor's notice, she was already among the most promising covert agents in the Empire's vast intelligence network. It was during this period where Palpatine began to see Shira as more than another disposable asset. Unlike the Inquisitors or the Emperor's hands, she was something of a hybrid, a highly skilled operative who combined military discipline with force sensitivity. Some sources even suggest Palpatine saw in her the possibility of a unique tool, someone who could operate far beyond the reach of typical dark side enforcers, blending espionage and the Force in ways that Vader seldom could. Her fate changed dramatically though in a single moment. During a mission against the Rebel Alliance where she had gone deep undercover, the Force itself alerted Luke Skywalker to her danger, and Luke shot her starfighter down. This would alter her life forever. Her injuries were catastrophic, but rather than let her die, she was retrieved and reconstructed with extensive cybernetic implants, enhancements that left her less than fully human in both body, and some would argue, in her very spirit. In the aftermath of her transformation, she took upon a new name, Lumaya. It was Vader, not Sidious, who took the most active role in her rebirth though. Vader personally oversaw her training in the dark side, teaching her to use that of anger and pain as tools of power. He instructed her in the construction of her own unique weapon, the Light Whip, a lightsaber so unorthodox that even seasoned Jedi struggled to counter it. Yet, Palpatine was never blind to what Vader was doing. He watched Lumaya's development with cold curiosity, evaluating whether this newly forged disciple may someday serve a purpose beyond covert assignments, something more. And while Sidious almost certainly never intended to elevate Lumaya to full Sith apprenticeship during Vader's life, he also never forbade her training. In typical fashion, he allowed her existence to act both as a contingency and a provocation, a subtle reminder to Vader that no one was indispensable. For her part, Lumaya was ambitious. She did not simply want to be another assassin or inquisitor. She studied alchemy, learned obscure rituals, and embraced her hybrid existence as proof of her commitment. Over time, she came to believe that she was destined for something greater, a destiny that Palpatine never quite confirmed, but never explicitly denied. Vader's view of Lumaya was more complex. Unlike Mara Jade, whom he saw as an irritant, Lumaya had survived unimaginable trauma and returned more powerful and dangerous than ever. He respected her resolve and her capacity for cruelty, but even he understood that her training was incomplete. However formidable as she would become, she was not a true rival, more of an experiment, a testament to Vader's ability to mold a servant in his own image. After Palpatine's death, Lumaya finally seized the identity that she had long since coveted. In the years following Endor, she declared herself a Dark Lady of the Sith, embracing the legacy that neither Vader nor Sidious had ever formally granted her. Her claim was more than a hollow boast though. She would eventually mentor Jacen Solo, guiding him to becoming Darth Vaticus, one of the most destructive Sith Lords in galactic history. It is in this later chapter of her life that cements Lumaya as one of the most consequential darkside figures to emerge from the Empire. While she was never truly positioned to replace Vader in Palpatine's eyes, she came closer to realizing the Sith's enduring legacy than any other Imperial agent or operative. And beyond all of them, Lumaya did become a Sith, though not a part of the lineage of the Rule of Two. Lumaya's story is a study of contrast. She was created by Vader, observed by Palpatine, and ultimately left to forge her own destiny. In her ambition, she revealed just how far the Emperor's reach extended, and how few were ever permitted to cross the threshold to servant to true heir. Among all the contenders who emerged in the shadow of Vader, none came closer to embodying the raw potential, though, of that of another, Galen Marek, the apprentice the galaxy would come to know as Starkiller. From the beginning, Starkiller was a secret born of Vader's disappointment. Years into his service as Palpatine's enforcer, Vader's resentment for his master festered. He saw himself as incomplete, a crippled reminder of what he could have been. Palpatine's constant provocations and the Emperor's praise of lesser servants only deepened his resolve to create a successor, one who would surpass them all. When Vader discovered the young Galen on the world of Kashyyyk, hiding among the last remnants of the Jedi, he sensed something extraordinary, a child whose Force signature burned with the ferocity few beings ever possessed. He did not hesitate. Vader killed Galen's father and took the boy in secret, raising him not as a son, but as a weapon. From the first day of his training, Starkiller was taught only one principle. The Force was power, and it must be wielded without restraint. Vader never taught him subtlety or balance. There was no meditation on the living Force, no study of harmony nor peace. What existed was only domination, only the raw, unrelenting violence of the dark side. Starkiller was a gamble as audacious as it was heretical. Starkiller would become the instrument by which Vader would overthrow the Emperor and claim the destiny that he believed Sidious had stolen. Under Vader's brutal tutelage, Starkiller's abilities grew at an astonishing rate. He mastered lightsaber combat, learned how to hurl starships from the sky, and obliterated Jedi survivors who had eluded the Empire for decades. His power was so monumental that for a time, he truly became a legitimate contender for the title of Sith Lord. Yet, in that single-minded pursuit of strength, Vader overlooked something essential. Starkiller was not born of darkness. His mother and father had been Jedi, and the memories of that lineage, though buried, were never truly erased. When Starkiller began to uncover the truth of his origins, something stirred within him. He began to understand that while Vader had shown him limitless potential of the dark side, he had never shown him the meaning of the Force itself. Starkiller had never heard its stillness, never felt the peace that his parents had once embraced. The light called to him in a way that Vader had not foreseen. In that connection, he discovered purpose beyond vengeance. Ironically, it was this rediscovered heritage that made him truly dangerous. A Force wielder of staggering power with the heart no longer fully bound to the dark side, Starkiller became a threat that neither Vader nor Palpatine could control. Palpatine's discovery of Starkiller was inevitable, but rather than immediately destroy the boy, the Emperor allowed the conspiracy to continue. Amused to see whether Vader's secret weapon could be molded into something useful, or simply bait to expose hidden enemies. In the end, Starkiller would choose his own path, and when given the chance to strike down the Emperor and seize the power that he had trained to crave, he refused. He embraced the legacy of his parents and turned that power to protect rather than destroy. In his final moments, Starkiller sacrificed himself to save the fledgling rebellion, forging a spark that would one day consume the entirety of the Empire. Yet, even in death, Starkiller proved something about the nature of Darth Vader. For all his injuries, for all his bitterness, Vader survived the assault of his own apprentice, a testament to his enduring strength as a true Sith. Starkiller's power was immense, but Vader's mastery was still greater. In all the long years of service to Sidious, only one other figure ever made Vader question whether he could hold that place. Only one other candidate inspired Palpatine to cast aside every contingency and to make a true offer of succession. And that final choice did not come from the Emperor's experiments or Vader's ambition. It came from the bloodline that started it all. In the end, all of Palpatine's schemes, every experiment, every secret apprentice, every contingency, led to a single figure: Luke Skywalker. From the first moment the Emperor learned of Luke's existence, he knew the son of Anakin Skywalker represented something none of his other servants ever could. Here was a being unbroken by tragedy, unscarred by betrayal, a vessel of the same extraordinary potential that had once burned in Anakin, but untouched by decades of servitude or hatred. Unlike Lumaya, who had been shaped by Vader's instruction, or Starkiller, who had been forged through relentless brutality, Luke was a blank canvas. To Palpatine, this made him the ultimate prize. If he could be turned, he would not merely replace Vader, he would surpass him. This was not a hidden conspiracy or a contingency plan. It was the final open gamble of a ruler who believed that he had already conquered every other challenge in the galaxy. When the moment came, Palpatine orchestrated it with meticulous care. He allowed the Rebel Alliance to come to Endor, drawing Luke into the trap that he had waited years to spring. He understood that raw power alone could not corrupt the Jedi of Luke's strength. Only love and fear. Only the threat of losing his father and his friends. That would break the Jedi. In that darkened throne room aboard the second Death Star, the Emperor laid bare his final design. He provoked Luke with the image of his friends dying, with the certainty that the rebellion would fail. He taunted him with the knowledge that only hatred could save the people that he loved, and for a moment, it seemed that that plan would succeed. As Luke struck down at Vader in a frenzy of rage, Palpatine saw what he had always hoped to see: the birth of a new Sith Lord, powerful enough to eclipse any who had come before him. Unlike Lumaya, whose ambitions had always been constrained by doubt, or Starkiller, whose loyalties had been divided, Luke burned with an unrestrained fury. And in that moment, Palpatine did something he had never done with any other apprentice. He offered the throne without reservation. Strike me down, and your journey to the dark side will be complete. Take your father's place at my side. This was no deception, no half-hearted test. For the first time since Anakin's fall, Palpatine was prepared to discard Vader entirely. He saw in Luke the perfected heir that he had always dreamed of, a being who could establish a Sith dynasty without rival. But where every other candidate had failed, where every other contender had seized upon the promise of power, Luke did something no one else could. He stepped back from the abyss. He looked down at his father and his severed hand, at the cybernetics that had become his own, and he finally saw the truth. Never. I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me. In that instant, the Emperor's last and greatest plan was undone. The perfect apprentice he had longed for had rejected him utterly in this moment. All the power in the galaxy could not compel Luke to become the monster that Palpatine needed him to be. And for Vader, broken, scarred, and shackled by decades of self-loathing, it was the final revelation. He saw in Luke's refusal everything that he had lost, everything that he had been, and for the first time in decades, Vader chose something other than fear, other than hate. As Palpatine's rage consumed the throne room, the Emperor finally understood what none of his countless apprentices, assassins, or experiments had ever shown him. In the end, all his ambitions would be defeated not by strength, but by compassion. Of all the contenders who stood in Vader's shadow, only Luke Skywalker could have ever truly replaced him, and only Luke Skywalker could have saved him. In all of the years of conquest, treachery, and manipulation, Palpatine never stopped searching for the perfect apprentice. From the moment Anakin Skywalker knelt before him, Sidious believed he had found the heir who would one day surpass every Sith who had come before. And yet, for all the power that Anakin possessed, it slipped right through Palpatine's grasp in a single stroke of destiny and flame. When the black armor was sealed around Vader's burned body, the Emperor did not see a triumph. He saw only failure, a ruined vessel. For years, Sidious never hid that disappointment. He humiliated Vader in private. He praised lesser servants in his presence. He tested his loyalty with the provocations of impossible orders. He fostered rivalries with figures like Mara Jade and allowed rumors of replacement to fester. But in time, something changed. While the Inquisitors were consumed by their own pettiness, while Lumaya's ambitions were never fully crystallized, while Starkiller died defiant, and Luke refused the darkness, Vader endured. He became more than a weapon. He became an instrument of pure, unrelenting domination. In Vader, Palpatine saw not the promise of a chosen one fulfilled, but something perhaps more useful. A creature whose every breath was now agony, whose every moment was hatred. In Dark Empire, Sidious reflected on this legacy with a strange, almost satisfied contempt. He calls Vader a minor masterpiece, not because he was the strongest Sith who ever walked the galaxy, but because he was the most perfectly broken. Vader had been transformed into a creature of the dark side so absolute that he no longer needed purpose beyond submission. He hunted Jedi without question. He carried out every atrocity without remorse. His pain became fuel, and his fury became legend. In the end, no apprentice, no matter how skilled, no matter how promising, ever fully replaced him. It was Darth Vader who enforced the new order. Vader who broke the last embers of the Jedi. Vader whose silhouette became the symbol of the Empire's unstoppable, unquestionable will. Its dominance. Palpatine never forgot what had been lost on Mustafar. He never stopped dreaming of an heir who would rise above Vader's limitations. But in the quiet recesses of his thoughts, even Sidious came to respect what he had created. A man who could have been a savior, turned into the perfect monster. A figure who embodied every lesson of the Sith, that fear is stronger than hope, that pain is stronger than love, and that nothing could be more powerful than the desire to dominate. He was not the dynasty the Emperor had imagined. He was not the living god the Sith had long since prophesied. But in his own savage, terrible way, Darth Vader became the truest disciple that the dark side had ever produced. And in that final judgment, perhaps the most telling truth was this: even broken, Vader was irreplaceable. And so, my friends, those were the apprentices that Palpatine rejected in favor of Darth Vader. I do hope that you've enjoyed today's longer holocron, and if you stayed till the end, if all of the apprentices or would-be apprentices were to duel, who do you believe would come out on top? But as always, thank you so much for joining us here in the archives again today, and may the Force be with you.